The night descended upon Thebes like a shroud of indigo silk, studded with stars that the priests claimed were the tears of Nut, the sky goddess, weeping for the mortal children she could never embrace. And in the narrow streets of the artisans' quarter, where mud brick houses leaned against each other like weary travelers, Merit Ptah was grinding herbs by lamplight when the knock came, 3 sharp raps followed by 2 soft ones, the signal that meant someone of importance required her services, and she set down her pestle with hands that trembled, not from fear, but from the prescient knowledge that this summons would alter the course of her destiny in ways she could not yet fathom. Merit Ptah had been a midwife for 23 years, having learned the sacred art from her grandmother Nefertari, who had caught babies for the wives of viziers and generals, and her mother Iset, who had delivered 347 children before a fever took her to the field of reeds. And Merit Ptah herself had brought forth 219 souls into the world of the living, losing only 12 to the hungry demons that lurked in the space between the womb and the first breath, a record that made her the most sought-after midwife in all of Thebes, though she lived modestly in a 3-room house with her daughter Nefru and kept her prices fair even when nobles offered her gold enough to build a tomb worthy of a prince. She opened the door to find not the expected servant, but a man dressed in the fine linen of the palace guard, his bronze armband bearing the cartouche of Pharaoh Amenhotep III himself, and his face was stern beneath the lamp's flickering light as he spoke in the clipped tones of Memphis, saying that the Lady Mutemwiya, wife of the chief architect, Amenhotep Sise, required her immediate attendance, for the baby was coming early and the situation was delicate, and Merit Ptah noticed how he emphasized that last word, delicate, as though it carried meanings within meanings like the nested boxes that held a queen's jewelry. She gathered her supplies with practiced efficiency, the linen strips boiled and dried, the knife of obsidian sharper than any bronze blade for cutting the birth cord, the oil of moringa for massaging the belly, the powder of dried lotus for stopping bleeding, the amulets of Taweret, the hippopotamus goddess, and Bes, the dwarf god who protected women in childbirth, the special tea made from herbs she had sworn never to reveal, gathered under the full moon and blessed by a priestess of Hathor, and she wrapped everything in a leather satchel that had belonged to her grandmother, its surface worn smooth by decades of midnight summons and desperate calls. The guard led her through streets emptied by the curfew that Pharaoh had imposed after the grain riots of last month, when the Nile's flood had been insufficient, and the common people had stormed the warehouses demanding bread, and Merit Ptah remembered the blood on the temple steps and the bodies floating in the sacred lake, offerings to crocodile Sobek that he had not requested, and she wondered what connection that violence might have to this midnight summons. For in Egypt nothing happened in isolation. Every event was a thread in the great tapestry woven by the gods, and a midwife learned to see patterns that others missed. They passed the great temple of Amun-Ra, its pylons looming against the starlit sky like the legs of a colossus, and Merit Ptah whispered a prayer to Hathor, asking the goddess of women to guide her hands and give her wisdom, for she sensed that this birth would require not just her skill with difficult deliveries, but also her ability to navigate the treacherous waters of palace politics, something her grandmother had warned her about in the days before her death, when she had gripped Merit Ptah's hand with surprising strength and whispered that the most dangerous births were not those where the baby was breech or the mother bled too much, but those where the child's parentage carried implications for the throne, for power, for the delicate balance that kept Egypt from tearing itself apart like a papyrus scroll left too long in the sun. The house of Amenhotep Sise was not truly a house, but a small palace, its walls painted with scenes of the architect's greatest achievements, the temple at Karnak, the pleasure palace at Malkata, the tomb being prepared for Pharaoh himself in the western hills, where the sun died each night and was reborn each dawn, and as Merit Ptah was led through corridors lit by oil lamps in alabaster holders, she saw servants who would not meet her eyes, their faces tight with fear, or perhaps knowledge of secrets they dared not speak, and she felt the weight of unseen eyes watching from behind carved wooden screens, assessing her, judging whether she could be trusted with whatever mystery was unfolding in the birth chamber. The Lady Mutemwia was in the traditional birthing position, kneeling on bricks while two servant women supported her arms, and Merit Ptah's experienced eye immediately assessed the situation. The lady was indeed in labor, her contractions strong and regular, but something was wrong with the timing, for Mutemwia's belly was too large for a woman who should have been only 7 months pregnant, according to the dates Merit Ptah had been given. And when she examined the lady more closely, she realized, with a shock, that this baby was full term, that the lady had been lying about when she conceived, or had been lied to about it, or that someone had altered the records, and Merit Ptah's mind raced through the implications, even as her hands moved with automatic competence, checking the position of the baby, feeling the strength of the contractions, judging how much longer until the moment of birth. Mutemwia was a beautiful woman despite the pain contorting her features, her skin the color of acacia honey, her eyes lined with kohl in the fashion of the royal court, and her wig, now askew from her laboring, was of the finest human hair dressed with lotus-scented oil. But what struck Merit Ptah most was the look of terror in those kohl-lined eyes, a fear that went beyond the natural anxiety of childbirth. And when their gazes met, Mutemwia grabbed Merit Ptah's wrist with surprising strength and whispered, "You must swear by Ma'at, goddess of truth, that what you see this night will remain sealed in your heart like a secret in a pharaoh's tomb." And Merit Ptah felt the words like a physical weight settling on her shoulders, for an oath sworn by Ma'at could not be broken without damning one's soul to be devoured by Amit, the eater of hearts, in the hall of judgment. Merit Ptah gave her oath, speaking the ancient words her grandmother had taught her, the midwife's vow to keep the secrets of the birthing chamber, and Mutemwia released her wrist and nodded, satisfied or perhaps simply too racked by another contraction to care, and Merit Ptah set to work, instructing the servant women to bring more lamps so she could see properly, to heat water and prepare the linens, to burn incense of frankincense and myrrh, to please the gods and cover the smell of blood and other fluids that accompanied every birth, and she gave Mutemwia a piece of leather to bite down on, for screaming was considered undignified for a noblewoman, though Merit Ptah privately thought that the gods had given women voices for a reason, and that using them in extremity was no shame. The labor progressed quickly, too quickly for a first birth, and Merit Ptah realized that this was not Mutemwia's first child, that the lady had given birth before, despite the official records claiming she had been barren until her marriage to Amenhotep Sai 3 years ago. And this revelation opened up new questions, new possibilities, new dangers. For if Mutemwia had borne a child before, where was that child now? And did its existence threaten someone powerful enough to make it disappear from all official records? And Merit Ptah found herself wondering if she had been summoned not just for her skill, but for her reputation as someone who could be trusted, or perhaps as someone who could be easily silenced if the secret she learned proved too dangerous to be allowed to live. The baby crowned as the moon reached its zenith, and Merit Ptah guided the head with gentle hands, whispering encouragements to Mutemwia, telling her when to push and when to breathe. And then with a final tremendous effort, the child slipped into Merit Ptah's waiting hands, and she saw immediately why this birth had been shrouded in such secrecy, for the baby was a boy, healthy and vigorous, but his skin was several shades darker than either Mutemwia's honey brown or the pale olive of Amenhotep Sai, whose portrait Merit Ptah had seen in the entrance hall, and his features, even in the first moments of life, showed the distinctive stamp of Nubian ancestry, the broad nose, the full lips, the shape of the skull, and Merit Ptah's hands continued their work automatically, clearing the baby's airway, cutting the cord with her obsidian knife, delivering the afterbirth, and checking that it was complete, but her mind was reeling with the implications of what she was seeing. With Amenhotep, son of Hapu, gone, Merit Ptah felt a strange sense of liberation, as though a weight she had been carrying for years had suddenly lifted, and she realized that she had been living in fear of his power, fear that he would ask her to do something even more morally questionable than what she had already done, fear that he would decide she knew too much and needed to be silenced. And now that fear was gone and she could breathe more freely, though the memories and the guilt remained, permanent scars on her conscience that no amount of time would fully heal. The political situation in Egypt continued to evolve in the directions that Queen Tiye had feared. For Crown Prince Amenhotep ascended to the throne as Amenhotep IV and immediately began his radical religious reforms, declaring that Aten, the sun disk, was the one true god and that all the other gods were false, closing temples and redirecting their wealth to the new religion, moving the capital from Thebes to a new city he built in the desert and called Akhetaten, the horizon of the Aten. And the disruption was enormous, touching every aspect of Egyptian life, creating resentment among the priests and nobles who lost their power and positions, causing economic hardship as the traditional temple-based economy was dismantled, and generating confusion and anxiety among common people who had worshipped the traditional gods their entire lives and did not understand why those gods were suddenly being declared non-existent. Merit Ptah watched these changes with concern, for she saw how they were tearing at the social fabric, creating divisions and conflicts that had not existed before, and she thought about Queen Tiye's warnings and wondered if the chaos the queen had predicted was beginning to unfold, if Egypt was entering a period of instability that might last for generations. And she worried about what kind of world Ptahshepses and Nefertari and all the other children she had brought into the world would inherit, whether they would have to live through civil war or foreign invasion or the collapse of the order that had made Egypt great. Queen Tiye herself died when Tutankhaten was 12 years old, and Merit Ptah mourned her sincerely, for despite their vast difference in status and the morally complicated nature of their relationship, she had genuinely cared for the queen and respected her intelligence and strength, and she attended the elaborate funeral ceremonies and watched as Tiye was laid to rest in a tomb in the Valley of the Kings, an honor usually reserved for pharaohs, but granted to her in recognition of her extraordinary influence and power. And Merit Ptah thought about all the secrets that were being buried with the queen, secrets that Tiye had carried to the grave. And she wondered if she herself would die with her secrets intact, or if someday the truth about Ptahshepses and Tutankhaten would emerge and reshape the historical understanding of this era. With Queen Tiye's death, young Tutankhaten lost his most important protector and guide, and Merit Ptah tried to maintain contact with the prince, offering what advice and support she could, but she was no longer welcome in the inner circles of the palace, for Pharaoh Amenhotep IV, who had changed his name to Akhenaten to reflect his devotion to the Aten, viewed her as a remnant of the old ways and a connection to his mother's political network, which he was systematically dismantling as he consolidated his power around his new religious vision. And Merit Ptah found herself relegated to the margins of court life, still technically the royal midwife, but rarely called upon for actual service. She focused instead on her regular practice, attending births throughout Thebes, and on training her daughter Nefru, who at 25 was now a skilled midwife in her own right. And Merit Ptah took satisfaction in passing on her knowledge and experience to the next generation, teaching Nefru not just the technical aspects of midwifery, but also the wisdom she had gained through her involvement in palace intrigues, the understanding that every birth was embedded in larger social and political contexts, that a midwife needed to be aware of these contexts even if she could not control them, and that sometimes the best service she could provide was simply to bring the baby safely into the world and let the politics sort themselves out. Ptahshepses at 15 was a serious young man, excelling in his studies and beginning to attract the attention of officials who were always looking for talented scribes to fill administrative positions, and Merit Ptah watched his progress with pride and a certain wistfulness, for she knew that soon he would move into circles where she would no longer have regular access to him, where he would take on responsibilities and form relationships that would define his adult life, and she would become just a family friend who visited occasionally, no longer the beloved auntie who had helped raise him, And this was natural and right, but it still made her sad, made her aware of time passing and of the transience of all relationships. One evening, Ptah came to visit her, which was unusual enough that Merit Ptah immediately sensed something was troubling him. And after they had shared a simple meal of bread and beer and lentils, he said, "Auntie Merit Ptah, I need to ask you something, and I need you to tell me the truth, no matter how difficult it might be." And Merit Ptah felt her heart begin to race, for she feared what question might be coming, feared that somehow he had discovered or suspected the truth about his origins. And she said carefully, "You know I have always been honest with you, Ptah. What is troubling you?" And he looked at her with eyes that seemed older than his 15 years, and said, "A man came to see me at school today, a stranger, and he told me that my parents are not my real parents, that I was adopted as a baby, that my true mother was a noble woman, and my true father was a great warrior. And he said that you know the whole story and have been keeping it from me all these years, and I need to know if this is true. I need to know who I really am." Merit Ptah felt as though the ground was shifting beneath her feet, and her mind raced through the possibilities, wondering who had sent this stranger, who had decided after all these years to reveal the secret, and whether this was an attack against her or against someone else, some new political maneuver that she did not yet understand. But looking at Ptah earnest face, at the confusion and hurt in his eyes, she knew that she could not lie to him anymore, that he deserved to know the truth, even if it was painful and complicated. And she took a deep breath and said, "Yes, it is true. You were adopted, and I have known your story from the beginning. And I have kept it secret because I was sworn to secrecy and because I believed that ignorance would protect you. But perhaps I was wrong. Perhaps you have a right to know where you came from, even if that knowledge brings you pain." She told him everything, about Mutemwia and Myherpri, about the political complications that had led to the decision to switch the babies, about Amenhotep, son of Hapu's manipulations, and the web of secrets and lies that had surrounded his birth. And as she spoke, she watched Ptah face transform from confusion to understanding to anger to grief, a whole spectrum of emotions playing across his features. And when she finished, there was a long silence. And then he said, "So my real father died trying to find me, died because he loved me and wanted to know me. And my real mother gave me away to protect me from political complications. And I have been raised by good people who are not my parents, and my whole life has been a lie. And you knew all of this, and never told me, never gave me the choice about whether I wanted to know the truth." Merit Ptah had no defense to offer, for everything he said was true, and she simply nodded and said, "You are right to be angry. I made choices about your life without your consent. I participated in a deception that robbed you of your true identity, and I did it because I was afraid, and because I was threatened, and because I convinced myself that I was protecting you. But perhaps I was really just protecting myself, protecting the comfortable life I had built, protecting my daughter from the consequences of my refusing to cooperate with powerful people. And I am sorry, Ptah. I am truly sorry. And if I could go back and make different choices, I am not sure I would, because I am not sure what the right choices were, but I am sorry that you have been hurt by the choices I made." Ptah sat in silence for a long time, and Merit Ptah waited, not trying to fill the silence with explanations or justifications, simply giving him space to process this enormous revelation. And finally he said, "I want to meet my real mother. I want to talk to her and ask her why she gave me away. I want to see if there is any resemblance, any connection. I want to know who I might have been if I had been raised as her son instead of as the son of a potter." And Merit Ptah nodded and said, "I can arrange that if you wish, though I warn you that it may not give you the answers or the closure you are seeking. For Mutemwia is a complicated person who has suffered greatly, and she made the best choice she could in impossible circumstances. And you may find that meeting her raises more questions than it answers." She arranged the meeting for the following week, sending a message to Mutemwia explaining that Ptah knew the truth and wanted to meet her, and Mutemwia's response was a mixture of joy and terror. for she had dreamed of this moment for 15 years but had also feared it, afraid that her son would hate her for abandoning him, afraid that she would not know what to say or how to bridge the gulf of years and experiences that separated them. And Merit Ptah understood these fears, for she shared them, wondering if she had done the right thing in facilitating this meeting, or if she was opening wounds that could never properly heal. The meeting took place in Merit Ptah's own house, neutral territory, where both Mutemwaya and Ptahshepses might feel more comfortable than they would in either of their own homes. And Merit Ptah watched as mother and son faced each other for the first time since the night of his birth, and the physical resemblance was undeniable. The same bone structure, the same way of holding themselves, and Merit Ptah saw recognition and something like pain flash across Mutemwia's face as she looked at this young man who was her son but also a stranger, who carried Myherpre's features and her own in a combination that was both achingly familiar and entirely new. They spoke for hours, Mutemwia telling Ptahshepses about his father, about Myherpre's courage and skill, and the love he had felt for the son he never got to know, and about the political forces that had made their relationship impossible, that had led to Myherpre's death and to the decision to give Ptahshepses to another family. And Ptahshepses listened with an intensity that suggested he was memorizing every word, building a picture of his origins and his heritage, trying to understand who he was and where he came from. And Merit Ptah sat quietly in the corner, present but not participating, giving them space to forge whatever connection they could. At the end of the conversation, Ptahshepses said to Mutemwia, "I do not hate you. I understand that you made an impossible choice, and that you did what you thought was best for me. But I need time to figure out what this all means, to decide who I am now that I know the truth about where I came from. And I do not know if we can have a relationship or what that relationship would look like, for you are not the mother who raised me. Tia is the one who cared for me when I was sick and taught me right from wrong and loved me every day of my life, and I cannot betray her by suddenly treating you as my real mother, but I also acknowledge that you gave birth to me and that we are connected by blood even if we are not connected by shared history." And Mutemwia nodded, tears streaming down her face, and said, "I do not ask for your love or even your forgiveness. I only ask that you remember your father, that you honor his memory by living a good life, and by being the kind of man he would have been proud of. And if you can do that, then my sacrifice and his death will have meant something." The revelation of Ptahshepses' true parentage had come from an unexpected source, as Merit Ptah discovered when she began investigating who had sent the stranger to reveal the truth, and she traced the information back to a faction at court that opposed the religious reforms of Pharaoh Akhenaten and that was looking for ways to destabilize his rule by revealing scandals and secrets from the previous reign. And they had discovered the story of Ptahshepses through old palace servants who had been present the night of the baby switch and who had been willing to talk in exchange for money and protection. And the faction had calculated that revealing the affair between a noblewoman and a Nubian champion would create sympathy for the old order and resentment against the kind of political manipulations that had characterized the reign of Amenhotep III, which they hoped to contrast unfavorably with the supposed moral purity of Akhenaten's religious vision. The irony was thick, Merit Ptah thought, for Akhenaten's reign was itself full of political manipulations and morally questionable decisions. And using Ptahshepses' story as a weapon in current political battles was just another example of powerful people treating individuals as game pieces, but she was powerless to stop it. And she watched with resignation as the story began to circulate through the court, distorted and embellished with each retelling, becoming less about the real people involved and more about abstract political points. And she thought about how history was made, how individual tragedies became political fodder, how truth became narrative, became myth, and how the people at the center of these stories lost their humanity in the process of becoming symbols. Ptahshepses weathered the scandal with surprising grace, refusing to be drawn into political machinations simply continuing his studies and beginning his work as a junior scribe in the administration, and Merit Ptah was proud of how he handled the sudden attention and the questions and the people who tried to use his story for their own purposes, and she saw in him a strength and integrity that she liked to think came from both his parents, from Myherpre's warrior courage and Mutamwia's aristocratic bearing, but also from Passerentia's humble decency and their emphasis on honest work and simple values. The political turmoil continued to build, and when Ptahshepses was 18, Pharaoh Akhenaten died suddenly, possibly from plague or possibly from poison, depending on which rumors you believed, and his young co-regent Tutankhaten ascended to the throne as the sole pharaoh, and the boy whom Merit Ptah had helped bring into the world was now the most powerful person in Egypt, responsible for the fate of millions. And she prayed that Queen Tia's faith in him had been justified, that he would have the wisdom and strength to navigate the complicated political situation he had inherited. Tutankhaten was only 9 years old when he became pharaoh, which meant that real power was exercised by a council of advisors dominated by two men: I, who had been Queen Tia's brother and was therefore Tutankhaten's great-uncle, and Horemheb, the commander of the army who represented the military's interests and who had opposed Akhenaten's religious reforms from the beginning. And Merit Ptah watched nervously as these two powerful men competed for influence over the young pharaoh, each trying to shape his policies and decisions, and she worried that Tutankhaten would become a puppet, a figurehead controlled by others rather than a true ruler. But she also saw signs that the boy had inherited his mother's intelligence and political acumen, that he was learning to play the advisors against each other and to carve out space for his own authority. One of Tutankhaten's first acts as pharaoh was to reverse many of Akhenaten's religious reforms, restoring the worship of the traditional gods, reopening the temples, and even changing his own name to Tutankhamun to reflect his allegiance to Amun-Ra rather than Aten. And while this was clearly done under the influence of the priestly faction that supported Ai, it was also a politically astute move that helped to stabilize the kingdom and restore the support of powerful groups that had been alienated by Akhenaten's radical changes. And Merit Ptah saw in these decisions the pragmatism that Queen Tia had valued, the willingness to compromise and adapt rather than pursuing ideological purity at the cost of political stability. Merit Ptah herself was, by this time, in her 60s, her hair gray and her hands beginning to show the joint pain that afflicted many people of her age. And while she still occasionally attended births, she had largely retired from active practice, leaving the work to Nefru, who had become the premier midwife in Thebes, inheriting her mother's reputation and clientele, and Merit Ptah spent her days tending her small garden, preparing herbal remedies, and occasionally consulting on difficult cases, living a quiet life that was a stark contrast to the years of political intrigue and moral complexity she had endured. She maintained her relationships with the various people whose lives she had touched, visiting Mutemwia and her daughter Nefertari, checking on Pacer and Tia, who were growing old themselves and were endlessly proud of their adopted son's success as a scribe, and occasionally receiving messages from the palace, inviting her to attend minor ceremonies or to consult on matters related to childbirth and women's health. And these connections to her past gave her life meaning and helped her feel that, despite all the compromises and moral failures, she had made a positive difference in the world, that she had brought children safely into life and had protected them as best she could from the dangers and complexities that surrounded them. Ptahshepses, at 20, had become a respected scribe in the administration, working in the department that managed grain distribution, a crucial role in a society where most people's survival depended on regular access to bread, and he had married a young woman named Kawit, the daughter of a minor official, and they had given Pacer and Tia the joy of grandchildren, twin girls, who were the light of their lives. And Merit Ptah visited the family regularly, delighting in the children's laughter and innocence, grateful that this branch of the complicated story she had been part of had led to happiness and normalcy, that Ptahshepses had built a good life despite the shocking revelations about his origins. Mutemwia's daughter Nefertari had grown into a beautiful young woman with her mother's grace and intelligence, and she had recently married into a family of high-ranking priests, a match that had elevated Mutemwia's social status and helped to rehabilitate her reputation after the scandals that had surrounded her earlier life. And Merit Ptah was glad for both mother and daughter, glad that they had found a way to move beyond the tragedies and build new lives, though she knew that Mutemwia still carried the weight of her losses, still mourned Myherpri, and thought about the son she had given away. And Merit Ptah understood that some wounds never fully healed, that some griefs became permanent parts of your identity, that you simply learned to carry with more grace over time. The young pharaoh Tutankhamun surprised everyone by proving to be more capable and independent than anyone had expected. And by the time he was 15, he had begun to assert his own authority, making decisions that sometimes went against the advice of Ai and Horemheb, showing that he had a mind of his own and a vision for Egypt's future. And Merit Ptah heard stories about his concern for the common people, about his orders to reduce taxes and increase grain distributions to areas suffering from poor harvests, about his support for rebuilding projects that would create employment and restore Egypt's infrastructure after the disruptions of Akhenaten's reign. And she thought about Queen Tiye and how proud she would have been of this boy who was growing into a wise and compassionate ruler. Merit Ptah was invited to the palace for a private audience with Pharaoh Tutankhamun when he was 16, and she went with some trepidation, for she had not seen him in several years, and she was not sure what he might want from her. And when she was brought into his presence, she was struck by how much he had grown, by how he had transformed from the child she remembered into a young man who carried himself with the dignity and authority of kingship. And he greeted her warmly and invited her to sit, another violation of protocol that suggested his mother's influence. And he said, "Merit Ptah, I have asked you to come because I have been thinking much about my mother, about her wisdom and her guidance, and I realize that you were one of the few people who knew her well, who saw her not just as queen, but as a person, and I want to talk to you about her, to understand her better through your memories, for I was so young when she died, and there is so much I wish I had asked her." They talked for hours, Merit Ptah sharing stories about Queen Tiye, about her intelligence and her political skill, but also about her fears and her hopes, about her love for her children and her dedication to Egypt's welfare. And Tutankhamun listened hungrily, absorbing these memories like water in the desert. And Merit Ptah could see how much he missed his mother, how much he wished she was still alive to guide him through the challenges he faced. And she tried to give him what comfort she could, telling him that his mother had believed in him, had seen in him the qualities that would make him a great pharaoh, and that the best way to honor her memory was to continue the work she had started, to be the kind of ruler she had hoped he would become. At the end of the conversation, Tutankhamun looked at her with an expression that was both curious and knowing, and he said, "There is something else I wanted to ask you, something I have wondered about for years, and I think you are one of the few people who can tell me the truth." And Merit Ptah felt her heart skip a beat, wondering if he was about to ask about his true parentage, if he had somehow learned that Pharaoh Amenhotep III was not his biological father, and she prepared herself to decide whether to confirm his suspicions or to maintain the lie even now. And he said, "I want to know about the night I was born, about what happened, about whether my birth was as difficult as the stories suggest, for I have heard various accounts, and I am not sure which to believe, and I want to understand what my mother went through to bring me into the world." Merit Ptah felt relief wash over her, for this was a question she could answer honestly, without revealing the deeper secrets. And she told him about the long, difficult labor, about Queen Tiye's courage and determination, about the moment when he finally emerged into the world and cried with healthy lungs, and about the expression of love on his mother's face when she first held him. And as she spoke, she saw Tutankhamun's eyes shine with unshed tears. And she understood that knowing these details gave him a connection to his mother that he had been missing, a sense of how much she had wanted him and sacrificed for him. and Merit-Ptah was glad that she could give him this gift, even if there were other truths she had to keep hidden. The audience ended with Tutankhamun thanking her and presenting her with a gift, a beautiful necklace of gold and lapis lazuli that was far too fine for a retired midwife, but that she accepted graciously, understanding that it was his way of honoring both her and his mother's memory. And as she left the palace, she thought about the strange turns her life had taken, how a simple midwife from the artisan's quarter had become entangled in the fates of queens and princes, how her decisions and her silences had helped shape the course of history in small but significant ways. And she wondered if anyone would ever know the full story, if someday future historians would piece together the secrets she had kept, or if they would remain buried forever, lost in the mists of time and the imperfect memories of those who had lived through these events. The years continued to pass, and Merit-Ptah watched the kingdom stabilize under Tutankhamun's rule, watched as the wounds caused by Akhenaten's reforms slowly healed, watched as trade and prosperity returned and the common people began to have hope again for the future, and she took some satisfaction in knowing that the child she had helped bring into the world was proving to be a good pharaoh, that Queen Tiye's faith in him had been justified, and she hoped that his reign would be long and peaceful, that he would have children who would continue the dynasty and ensure Egypt's stability for generations to come. But fate, as Merit-Ptah had learned over the years, was unpredictable and often cruel. And when Tutankhamun was just 19 years old, news reached her that he had died suddenly, the official story saying it was from an infection following a broken leg, though there were immediate whispers of assassination, of poison, of political enemies who had decided that the young pharaoh was becoming too independent and needed to be removed. And Merit-Ptah wept when she heard the news, wept for the boy she had helped bring into the world, for the promise and potential that had been cut short, for Queen Tiye, who had died believing her son would rule Egypt for decades and restore the kingdom to greatness. And she felt the weight of all the suffering and death that had surrounded this family, all the political machinations and power struggles that had destroyed so many lives. The succession was chaotic, for Tutankhamun had died without an heir, and his young widow, Ankhesenamun, was left vulnerable and alone. And Merit-Ptah heard rumors that the queen had sent desperate letters to the Hittite king begging him to send a prince for her to marry, preferring a foreign husband to being forced to marry one of the Egyptian officials who were circling like vultures. And Merit-Ptah understood the queen's desperation, understood how terrifying it must be to be a young woman with no male protector in a court full of ambitious men who saw her as a prize to be won or an obstacle to be eliminated. And she wished she could help, but knew that she had no power in such matters, that the games of the great were beyond her ability to influence. In the end, I, the great uncle who had been one of Tutankhamun's chief advisors, became pharaoh, marrying the young widow to legitimize his claim to the throne, though it was widely believed that Ankhesenamun had been forced into the marriage against her will, and I's reign was brief, only 4 years before he died of old age, and then Horemheb, the military commander, seized the throne and began a systematic effort to erase the memory of the entire Amarna period, the era of Akhenaten's reforms and the brief reigns of his successors, removing their names from king lists and destroying monuments that mention them, trying to create a historical narrative that skipped directly from Amenhotep III to himself, as though the intervening years had never happened. Merit-Ptah watched this historical erasure with a mixture of sadness and bitter irony, for she had lived through those years, had been intimately involved in events that were now being officially declared to have never occurred, and she thought about how history was written by the victors, how the truth was often the first casualty of political transitions, and how the people who had lived and suffered and died during those erased years were being robbed of their place in memory, condemned to a second death more final than the first, and she wondered if her own memories would die with her, if the secrets she carried would be lost forever when she passed into the afterlife. Ptahshepses came to visit her one evening, and he was now 35 years old, a senior scribe with responsibilities and respect, and he told her that he had been thinking about his origins and about the political forces that had shaped his life. And he said, "Auntie Merit Ptah, I want to write down the true story of what happened, the story of my parents and the baby switch, and all the political manipulations. I want to create a record so that someday people will know the truth, so that my Herpri will be remembered as the honorable man he was, rather than being erased from history like so many others. And I want you to help me, to tell me everything you know, so that I can write it accurately." And Merit Ptah felt torn, for part of her wanted to support this effort to preserve the truth, but part of her feared the consequences of creating such a document, feared that it would be discovered and used against people she cared about, or that it would make Ptahshepses a target for those who wanted the past to stay buried. She counseled caution, saying, "The truth is important, but so is survival, and there are still powerful people who would not want this story to be known, who might see such a document as a threat to the legitimacy of their own power, and I would not want you to put yourself at risk for the sake of historical accuracy. Your life and your family's safety are more important than ensuring that future generations know what really happened." But Ptahshepses was determined, and he said, "I understand the risks, but I also understand that if we do not preserve these stories, they will be lost forever, and people like my father will simply disappear from history as though they never existed. And I cannot accept that. I cannot let his memory be erased without fighting to preserve it." And Merit Ptah saw in his eyes the same determination that she imagined Myherpri must have had, the same unwillingness to accept injustice quietly, and she knew that she could not dissuade him, could only help him do it as safely as possible. They worked together over the following months, Merit Ptah recounting everything she could remember about the events surrounding Ptahshepses's birth and the subsequent political intrigues, and Ptahshepses wrote it all down in the formal hieratic script he had mastered, creating a document that was part historical record and part personal memoir. And they discussed what to do with the document once it was complete, where to hide it so that it would be preserved but not discovered by those who might destroy it, and they decided to seal it in a jar and bury it beneath the floor of Merit Ptah's house, with instructions left in Merit Ptah's will that the jar should not be opened until at least 2 generations had passed, by which time everyone directly involved in the events would be long dead and the political dangers would be diminished. The act of creating this record gave Merit Ptah a sense of completion, a feeling that despite all the compromises and deceptions she had been part of, she had ultimately served truth by ensuring that the real story would be preserved, even if it could not be told in her lifetime. And she thought about the future historians who might one day unearth this jar and read Ptahshepses's careful account, and she hoped they would understand the impossible choices people had faced, the way that personal virtue could conflict with political necessity, and the cost of maintaining order in a society where power was concentrated in the hands of a few who could shape reality according to their will. Mutemwia died when Merit Ptah was 70, passing away peacefully in her sleep after a short illness. And Merit Ptah attended the funeral and mourned the complicated woman who had been both victim and participant in the events that had defined so much of Merit Ptah's middle years. And she reflected on how Mutemwia's life had been shaped by a single choice, or perhaps by a series of choices, to love unwisely and then to give away the child born of that love, and how those choices had created ripples that affected so many other lives. And she wondered if Mutemwia had found peace at the end, had been able to forgive herself for the decisions she made and the losses she suffered. Pazar and Tia died within months of each other, as elderly couples often do, and their deaths hit Merit Ptah hard, for they had been good people who had loved Ptahshepses unconditionally and had given him a stable, happy childhood despite the complications of his origins. And at their funeral, Merit Ptah spoke about how they embodied the best of ordinary human decency, how they had raised a child who was not biologically theirs with the same care and devotion they would have shown to a child of their blood, and how their example showed that family was defined by love and commitment rather than by accident of birth. And she saw Ptahshepses weeping openly, and she knew that whatever else might be said about the baby switch and the political machinations, the outcome had been that a child was raised by people who truly wanted him, and that was worth something, even if the means of achieving it had been morally questionable. Merit Ptah herself was by now in her mid-70s, an advanced age for ancient Egypt, where most people did not live past 50, and she felt the weight of her years in her aching joints and failing eyesight, and the way she tired easily from tasks that had once been effortless, and she knew that her time was limited, that soon she would make her own journey to the afterlife and face the judgment of the gods. And she thought about what she would say when Anubis weighed her heart against the feather of truth, how she would account for all the lies and deceptions and moral compromises she had been part of, and she hoped that the gods would also weigh her intentions and her efforts to protect the innocent, and her dedication to bringing life into the world, and that those would balance against the wrongs she had done or allowed to be done. She spent her final years in quiet contemplation, tending her garden and playing with Ptahshepses's grandchildren, for he now had several, and making peace with her past and preparing for her death. And she composed the prayers she wanted recited at her funeral, and made arrangements for a modest tomb, nothing elaborate, for she had never accumulated wealth, despite her service to the powerful. And she left instructions that her most precious possession, the leather satchel that had belonged to her grandmother, should be given to Nefru to pass down to future generations of midwives in their family, a tangible link to the women who had come before and those who would come after. One afternoon, as she sat in her courtyard watching the play of sunlight on the lotus flowers in her small pool, Nefru came to her with news that a young woman was in labor and having difficulties, and the family was asking for Merit Ptah specifically. And even though Nefru was perfectly capable of handling the birth, Merit Ptah felt a sudden desire to attend one more birth, to practice her art one final time. And she gathered her strength and her supplies and went with Nefru to the house of the laboring woman. And when she arrived, she found a scene that was achingly familiar. The woman on the birthing bricks, the supporting attendants, the smell of incense and sweat and fear, and Merit Ptah felt all her years of experience click into place, felt her hands remember their skill even though they trembled with age, and she guided the woman through the labor with gentle encouragement and practical advice. And when the baby finally emerged, a healthy girl with a powerful cry, Merit Ptah received her into her hands and felt a surge of joy and gratitude. Gratitude that she had been given this gift one more time, the privilege of witnessing the miracle of new life. And she thought about all the babies she had caught over her long career, all the lives she had helped to begin, and she felt that despite everything, despite all the political complications and moral compromises, this was what mattered. This simple act of helping a woman bring her child safely into the world, this was the core of who she was and what she had dedicated her life to, and it was enough. Merit Ptah died 3 weeks later, peacefully in her sleep, and she was buried with the honors appropriate to a respected elder of the community, and her funeral was attended by dozens of families whose children and grandchildren she had delivered, and Ptahshepses gave a eulogy in which he called her a woman of courage and compassion who had navigated impossible circumstances with grace and had protected those she loved, even at great personal cost. And he did not mention the political intrigues or the secrets she had kept, for that was not the story that needed to be told at her funeral. That was not the truth that mattered to the people gathered to mourn her. And Merit Ptah would have approved of that discretion, would have understood that there were many truths, and that choosing which to speak and when was itself an act of wisdom. The jar containing Ptahshepses's account was indeed buried beneath the floor of Merit Ptah's house as planned, and there it remained for many years, surviving the demolition and rebuilding of the house above it, surviving the rise and fall of dynasties and the gradual silting over of the site as the Nile's annual floods deposited layer upon layer of mud, surviving the centuries that transformed ancient Egypt from a living civilization into archaeological ruins, and it was finally discovered by archaeologists in the early 20th century of the modern era, more than 3,000 years after it had been written, and the hieratic text was translated and published and became one of the most valuable first-hand accounts of life in the Egyptian court during the late 18th dynasty, and historians debated its accuracy and its implications, and some questioned whether it was genuine or a later forgery, but most agreed that it provided unique insights into the political machinations and personal dramas that the official records had erased or obscured. The account revealed the truth about Tutankhamun's parentage, confirming what some scholars had long suspected based on artistic depictions and other indirect evidence, and it provided details about Queen Tiye's political acumen and Amenhotep, son of Hapu's manipulations that helped historians understand the complex dynamics of the court. And it told the story of Maherpri, whose tomb had been discovered in the Valley of the Kings, but whose exact relationship to the royal family had been uncertain, and it explained why his burial had been so richly provisioned despite his apparently modest official status, for the account made clear that he had been a favorite of Pharaoh Amenhotep III and the father of Queen Tiye's last child, though whether the rich burial was arranged by Tiye before her death or by Amenhotep, son of Hapu, as a kind of compensation for ordering Maherpri's execution was unclear. But perhaps more importantly, the account preserved the story of ordinary people caught up in extraordinary circumstances, people like Merit Ptah, who did their best to navigate moral complexity with limited power and imperfect information, people like Mutemwia, who made choices that haunted them for the rest of their lives, people like Pacer and Tia, who loved a child who was not biologically theirs with complete devotion, and these human stories resonated across the millennia, reminding modern readers that ancient Egyptians were not so different from themselves, that they faced the same fundamental questions about loyalty and truth, and the conflict between personal ethics and political necessity, and that the grand sweep of history was made up of countless individual decisions and small acts of courage or cowardice or compromise. Ptahshepses himself had become a minor historical figure, mentioned in several administrative documents as a skilled scribe who had worked in the grain distribution department during the reigns of Tutankhamun I, and Horemheb and his tomb, though modest, had been discovered intact and contained burial goods that suggested he had achieved a comfortable middle-class status, and among those goods were amulets depicting Taweret and Bes, the gods who protected women in childbirth, which archaeologists had initially found puzzling for a male burial, but which the account explained as a tribute to Merit Ptah and her profession, a way for Ptahshepses to honor the woman who had watched over him since birth and who had helped him understand his complicated origins. The account also shed light on the practice of baby switching and adoption in ancient Egypt, suggesting that it was more common than previously thought, that powerful families regularly used such strategies to manage succession issues and conceal embarrassing situations, and that there were networks of trusted midwives and servants who facilitated these arrangements, and this led historians to re-examine other royal births and to question whether some of the clear lines of succession shown in the official records might actually conceal similar complications, whether other pharaohs might have been born to different parents than the ones officially recorded, and whether the divine right of kings might have rested on foundations that were more fragile and more human than the official ideology suggested. In the end, Merit Ptah H's story became a lens through which scholars understood the gap between official history and lived reality, between the polished narratives inscribed on temple walls and the messy, complicated truth of how power actually operated, between the image of Egypt as an eternal and unchanging civilization perfectly ordered according to Ma'at, and the reality of a society full of the same conflicts and compromises and moral ambiguities that characterized every human civilization, and her account became required reading for students of ancient history, not because it revealed great battles or architectural achievements, but because it revealed the human dimension of history, the way that individual choices and personal relationships shaped events in ways that were often invisible in the official record, but were no less real or important for being hidden. The debate over Merit Ptah's character and choices continued among historians, with some praising her for protecting the children in her care and navigating impossible circumstances with wisdom, while others criticized her for participating in deceptions that robbed people of their true identities and for serving the interests of the powerful at the expense of individual autonomy and truth. And this debate reflected larger questions about how we judge historical figures, whether we should evaluate them by the standards of their own time or by universal ethical principles, whether we should emphasize their intentions or their actions, whether we should focus on the good they did or the harm they caused, or try to acknowledge the complexity of moral life, in which people are rarely purely good or purely evil, but rather mixtures of virtue and vice trying to do their best. In difficult situations, some feminist scholars particularly praised Merit Ptah as an example of a woman who exercised agency and influence in a patriarchal society, who used her professional skills and her understanding of power dynamics to protect herself and those she cared about, who forged connections across class boundaries and created networks of mutual support among women, and who preserved knowledge and passed it down through generations of female practitioners. And they saw her as representative of countless women throughout history who worked within oppressive systems to create spaces of autonomy and to mitigate the worst effects of male dominance, even though the price of such survival often involved moral compromise and complicity with unjust structures. Others focused on Merit Ptah's role as a knowledge keeper and transmitter of medical expertise, noting that the account included detailed descriptions of her methods for managing difficult births, her use of herbs and oils and massage, her understanding of when to intervene and when to let nature take its course, and her psychological insight into how to support women through the fear and pain of labor. And medical historians studied these descriptions and found that many of Merit Ptah's techniques were remarkably sophisticated, based on careful observation and accumulated experience, and that ancient Egyptian midwives had a knowledge base that in some ways rivaled or exceeded that of male physicians. Though their knowledge was practical and experiential rather than theoretical, and was often dismissed or ignored by the male-dominated medical establishment, the account also sparked renewed interest in the role of midwives in political history, leading scholars to investigate other cases where midwives might have been involved in royal succession disputes or baby switches, and to consider how the intimate knowledge that midwives possessed about births and parentage gave them a kind of power that was different from official authority, but was nonetheless significant: the power of knowing secrets that others desperately wanted to keep hidden, the power of being present at the most vulnerable moments of powerful people's lives, and the power of being able to confirm or deny claims about legitimate descent and succession. And this led to a broader reevaluation of the role of women in ancient political systems, recognizing that while women were largely excluded from formal power structures, they often exercised informal influence through their control of domestic spaces and intimate knowledge. The story of Myherpri and Mutemwia also resonated with modern readers, who saw in their doomed love affair echoes of countless other cross-cultural or cross-class romances that had been thwarted by social prejudice and political considerations, and the tragic outcome of their relationship, with Myherpri executed on false charges and Mutemwia forced to give up her child and live with guilt and grief for the rest of her life, became a symbol of the human cost of maintaining social hierarchies and ethnic divisions. And some commentators drew parallels to more recent historical situations where interracial or intercultural relationships had been criminalized or punished, suggesting that the dynamics Merit Ptah described were not unique to ancient Egypt, but were part of larger patterns of how societies police boundaries and enforce conformity. The character who perhaps generated the most historical interest was Amenhotep, son of Hapu. For Merit Ptah's account provided unprecedented detail about how this powerful official operated, how he gathered information and managed secrets and manipulated people and events to achieve his goals, and historians use this information to reinterpret other known facts about his career and to understand how he had managed to accumulate such extraordinary power and influence. And some argued that he represented a type that appeared in many civilizations: the brilliant administrator who makes the system work, but who also treats people as means rather than ends, who prioritizes stability and order over individual rights and dignity, and who leaves a legacy that is impossible to evaluate simply as good or bad, but must be understood as a complex mixture of genuine service and self-serving manipulation. The account's description of how baby switches were actually carried out, with dead babies being substituted for living ones, and false records being created, and witnesses being bribed or threatened into silence, provided valuable insights into the mechanics of political deception in the ancient world, and it raised questions about how many other official records might be unreliable. How much of what we think we know about ancient Egyptian history might be based on deliberately falsified information, and how historians should approach sources knowing that powerful people in every era have had strong incentives to distort the truth and the means to do so effectively, and this led to a more critical and skeptical approach to ancient sources, with scholars paying more attention to inconsistencies and gaps and questioning official narratives more thoroughly. The fate of Tutankhamun, whose early death had long been a subject of speculation and controversy, was also illuminated by the account, for while Merit Ptah did not claim to know whether he had been assassinated or died of natural causes, her description of the political tensions surrounding his increasing independence and her portrayal of the ambitious officials who surrounded him provided context that made assassination seem plausible, and DNA analysis of his mummy, combined with the information in Merit Ptah's account, led some researchers to develop new theories about his parentage and his health, suggesting that the genetic issues caused by royal inbreeding might have been less severe in his case than previously thought, if his father was actually a healthy commoner rather than Pharaoh Amenhotep III, though this remained controversial and difficult to prove definitively given the limitations of ancient DNA analysis. Perhaps the most profound impact of Merit Ptah's account was the way it humanized ancient Egypt, transforming it from a civilization known primarily through monuments and treasures and formal inscriptions into a society of real people with recognizable emotions and moral dilemmas, and readers of the account found themselves identifying with Merit Ptah's struggles and sympathizing with her difficult choices. And this emotional connection helped to bridge the vast temporal and cultural gulf that separated the modern world from ancient Egypt, making it feel less like a distant and alien civilization and more like a different chapter in the ongoing human story, with the same fundamental themes of love and loss and loyalty and betrayal and the struggle to find meaning and maintain integrity in a complicated and often unjust world. The publication of the account also led to popular interest in Merit Ptah's story, with several novelists and filmmakers creating fictionalized versions that took the basic framework she had provided and elaborated on it, adding invented dialogue and dramatic scenes and emotional depth. And while historians sometimes criticized these adaptations for taking liberties with the known facts, they also acknowledged that they served an important function in bringing ancient history to life for general audiences and in highlighting the relevance of historical struggles to contemporary concerns, and Merit Ptah became a kind of folk hero, a symbol of women who navigate patriarchal systems with intelligence and courage, who protect the vulnerable even at personal cost, and who keep faith with truth even when lies would be easier and safer. In the scholarly community, Merit Ptah's account became a touchstone for debates about historical methodology and interpretation, with different scholars reading the same text and drawing very different conclusions based on their theoretical frameworks and their assumptions about human nature and social dynamics. And these debates were healthy and productive, pushing historians to articulate their assumptions more clearly and to engage seriously with alternative interpretations, and the account became a standard example in graduate seminars and methodology courses. used to teach students how to read historical sources critically and how to deal with the inevitable ambiguities and uncertainties that characterize our understanding of the past. The physical artifact itself, the sealed jar and the papyrus scroll it contained, became one of the prized possessions of the Egyptian Museum. Displayed in a climate-controlled case with careful lighting to prevent further deterioration, and visitors would stand before it and try to imagine the hands that had written these words more than 3,000 years ago. Try to imagine Ptah sitting with Merit Ptah and carefully recording her memories. Try to imagine the courage it must have taken to write such an account, knowing that discovery could mean death, and try to imagine the faith in the future that led them to believe that someday someone would find their testimony and would care about the truth they had preserved. The discovery of the account also prompted new archaeological investigations, with teams returning to sites associated with the people mentioned in Merit Ptah's narrative, hoping to find additional evidence that might corroborate or challenge her version of events. And excavations at the site of Mutemwia's house uncovered a small chamber that appeared to have been used as a birth room, with remains of the special bricks that women knelt on during labor and traces of the herbs and oils that Merit Ptah had described using. And this physical evidence lent credibility to the account and suggested that Merit Ptah had indeed been intimately familiar with the locations and practices she described, that this was not a later fabrication but a genuine first-hand testimony. Researchers also sought to trace Merit Ptah's descendants, to see if her family line had continued, and if there might be additional records or oral traditions that had been passed down through the generations, and they discovered that Nifru, Merit Ptah's daughter, had indeed continued the midwifery tradition and had trained her own daughter in turn, and that there were records of midwives in that family line for at least 6 more generations before the trail went cold, lost in the chaos of Egypt's later history. And this discovery of a multi-generational tradition of female professional expertise was significant in itself, challenging assumptions about the limitations on women's roles in ancient society and demonstrating that some women, at least, were able to create sustained careers and pass specialized knowledge through female lineages rather than having their skills and knowledge disappear with their deaths. The account's revelation about the use of baby switches and false records also had implications for understanding royal succession in other ancient civilizations, and comparative historians began to look for similar patterns in Mesopotamia and China and other complex societies where dynastic succession was crucial to political stability, and they found evidence suggesting that such practices were indeed more widespread than previously recognized, that many royal lines probably incorporated children of uncertain or concealed parentage, and that the official genealogies that modern scholars had been using to trace dynastic histories were likely riddled with deliberate falsehoods and strategic omissions. And this led to a more sophisticated understanding of how ancient royal families actually functioned, recognizing that biology and official status did not always align, and that the fiction of unbroken, legitimate descent was often maintained through elaborate deceptions. The ethical questions raised by Merit Ptah's choices continued to generate discussion not just among historians but in broader public conversations about professional ethics and personal responsibility, and her story was sometimes used in medical ethics courses as a case study for discussing the conflicts that can arise between professional duties and personal morality, between the obligation to maintain confidentiality and the obligation to prevent harm, and between the desire to protect individuals and the commitment to truth. And students would debate what they would have done in Merit Ptah's position, whether they would have refused to participate in the baby switch, even if it meant risking their own lives and their daughter's future, whether they would have revealed the truth about Tutankhamun's parentage when asked directly by the young pharaoh, and whether the preservation of political stability justified the lies and manipulations that Merit Ptah had been part of. Some argued that Merit Ptah had been complicit in grave injustices, that by going along with the baby switch, she had robbed Ptah of his true identity and condemned Mutemwia to a lifetime of grief that by spying on Queen Tie for Amenhotep, son of Hapu, she had betrayed a woman who had trusted her, and that by not speaking out against Myherpre's execution, she had become complicit in judicial murder. And these critics suggested that Merit Ptah represented the danger of the moral relativism that allowed good people to participate in evil systems by convincing themselves that they had no choice, or that they were minimizing harm, that their individual resistance would not change anything, and they argued that there is always a choice, even if it is the choice to suffer consequences rather than compromise principles, and that history honors those who stood up against injustice even when doing so was costly or futile, rather than those who accommodated themselves to evil in order to survive. Others defended Merit Ptah more vigorously, pointing out that she had lived in a society with very different moral frameworks and power structures than the modern world, that expecting her to behave according to modern ethical principles was anachronistic and unfair, that she had actually done remarkable things to protect the people in her care, that she had ensured Ptahshepses grew up in a loving home rather than being killed as a potential threat, that she had helped Queen Tie through a dangerous pregnancy and childbirth, that she had prevented Mutemwia from killing her second child in a moment of irrational grief, and that she had ultimately preserved the truth by helping Ptahshepses create the written account. And these defenders argued that moral judgment must take into account the constraints people operate under and the limited options available to them, and that heroic resistance is easier to call for in retrospect than to practice in the moment when your life and your loved ones' lives are at stake. The truth, as with most complex human situations, probably lay somewhere between these extremes, and most thoughtful readers of Merit Ptah's account came away with a deep appreciation for the difficulty of maintaining integrity in corrupt systems, with sympathy for the impossible position she had been placed in, and with humility about their own certainty that they would have acted differently or better in similar circumstances. And this uncertainty and moral complexity was perhaps the most valuable lesson the account offered. The reminder that history is made by real people facing real dilemmas with imperfect information and limited options, and that the comfortable moral clarity of hindsight is a luxury that those who actually lived through difficult times rarely enjoyed. The account also provided valuable information about daily life in ancient Egypt, details about food and clothing and housing and social interactions that were not typically recorded in the official documents that formed the basis for most historical knowledge, and Merit Ptah's descriptions of walking through the streets of Thebes, of the sounds and smells and sights she encountered, of the way different classes of people interacted, of the festivals and rituals that marked the passing years. All of this enriched the historical understanding of what it was actually like to live in ancient Egypt, moving beyond the abstract knowledge of kings and battles and building projects to a more intimate and human-scale picture of lived experience. Her descriptions of the practice of midwifery were particularly valuable, providing insights into medical knowledge and techniques that had largely been lost because they were not considered worthy of formal documentation by the male scribes who created most of the surviving records, and medical historians were able to piece together a more complete picture of ancient Egyptian obstetrics by combining Merit Ptah's practical descriptions with information from medical papyri and archaeological evidence, and they found that ancient midwives had surprisingly sophisticated understanding of pregnancy and childbirth, that they used techniques that would not seem out of place in modern midwifery, and that their empirical knowledge in some ways exceeded that of the male physicians who were more focused on theoretical frameworks and magical interventions than on practical observation and experience-based techniques. The account's description of Queen Tie was particularly significant because it provided a more intimate and nuanced portrait than the official inscriptions and diplomatic correspondence that were the usual sources for understanding her role. And historians were able to use Merit Ptah's observations to fill in gaps and to understand the personal motivations behind political decisions, to see Tie not just as a powerful political actor, but as a woman who loved her children and feared for their futures, who felt the weight of her responsibilities and the isolation of power, and who struggled to balance competing demands and loyalties, just like any other human being. And this more rounded portrait made her achievements all the more impressive, for it showed that she had accomplished extraordinary things not because she was somehow superhuman, but because she was fully human and yet still managed to exercise wisdom and courage and political skill in extremely difficult circumstances. The description of Amenhotep, son of Hapu's methods of gathering intelligence and maintaining control provided insights into the functioning of the ancient Egyptian state that challenged some previous assumptions about how centralized and bureaucratic the administration really was. For Merit Ptah made clear that much of the system's effectiveness depended on personal networks and informal relationships rather than formal institutional structures. That information flowed through channels of loyalty and obligation rather than through official reporting mechanisms, and that the stability of the kingdom rested not just on laws and procedures, but on the ability of skilled operators like Amenhotep, son of Hapu, to manage secrets and manipulate people, and this led historians to reconsider how ancient states actually functioned, recognizing that the neat organizational charts and hierarchies that scholars constructed from official titles and records probably did not capture the messy reality of how power actually worked. The account also shed light on attitudes toward race and ethnicity in ancient Egypt, a topic that had been controversial among scholars, with some emphasizing Egypt's cosmopolitan character and others highlighting evidence of ethnic prejudice and discrimination. And Merit Ptah's story of Myherpri and Mutemwiya suggested that the reality was complicated, that Nubians could achieve high positions and be trusted by Pharaoh, but that a relationship between a Nubian man and an Egyptian noblewoman was still considered scandalous enough to require elaborate cover-up, that individuals might be judged on their merits, but that ethnic background still mattered in ways that limited options and created vulnerabilities. And this nuanced picture helped scholars move beyond simplistic generalizations to a more sophisticated understanding of how ethnicity functioned in ancient Egyptian society. The fate of Ankhesenamun, Tutankhamun's widow, which Merit Ptah had mentioned only briefly, became the subject of renewed investigation, and researchers studied the evidence for her desperate letters to the Hittite king and her forced marriage to A, and her subsequent disappearance from the historical record, and they developed new theories about what might have happened to her, whether she had been killed or forced into a secondary wife's obscurity, or perhaps escaped to a foreign court. And while these theories remained speculative, the attention to Ankhesenamun's story highlighted the precarious position of royal women who lost their male protectors, and the way that women could be used as pawns in succession struggles, and this led to broader interest in the experiences of royal women in ancient Egypt and other ancient civilizations, in how they navigated political systems that gave them status but also made them vulnerable, and in how they exercised what agency they could within severe constraints. The publication of Merit Ptah's account also inspired artistic works that tried to capture her story and its themes, and several plays and operas and ballets were created that dramatized her life and the moral dilemmas she faced. And while these artistic interpretations necessarily took liberties with the historical record, filling in gaps and inventing dialogue and emphasizing certain aspects of the story for dramatic effect, they helped to keep the story alive in cultural memory and to make ancient Egypt feel relevant and meaningful to contemporary audiences who might not otherwise engage with historical scholarship. And the artists who created these works often used Merit Ptah's story to comment on contemporary issues, drawing parallels between ancient political manipulations and modern ones, between ancient women's struggles for agency and modern ones, and between ancient moral dilemmas and modern ethical controversies. A particularly influential novel based on Merit Ptah's account won major literary awards and became an international bestseller, introducing millions of readers to her story and sparking broader public interest in ancient Egyptian history. And while some historians criticize the novel for its departures from the known facts and its invention of romantic subplots and dramatic confrontations that had no basis in the historical record, others appreciated the way it brought ancient Egypt to life for general readers and inspired them to learn more about the actual history and the author herself acknowledged that she had taken liberties, but argued that the emotional truth of Merit Ptah's experience, the struggle to maintain integrity while caught between powerful forces, was more important than perfect historical accuracy in every detail, and that fiction could capture aspects of human experience that dry historical analysis might miss. The account raised questions about the nature of truth and historical knowledge that philosophers and theorists engaged with, asking whether there could be such a thing as objective historical truth when all our knowledge comes through subjective accounts like Merit Ptah's, filtered through her particular perspective and limited by what she could observe and understand, and whether historians should aim for a God's eye view of the past or acknowledge that history is always a collection of partial perspectives that can be assembled but never fully synthesized into a single coherent narrative. And these epistemological debates were not merely academic exercises, but had practical implications for how history was taught and how historical claims were evaluated, and how much confidence we could have in our understanding of the past. The discovery also prompted reflection on the relationship between memory and history, on how individual memories, like those Merit Ptah preserved, became collective historical knowledge, on what gets remembered and what gets forgotten and why, and on the role of power in shaping both individual memory and collective historical narrative. For Merit Ptah's account made clear that the official history being written in the temples and palaces bore little resemblance to the reality she had experienced, that powerful people were actively working to erase certain events and people from the record, and that only through extraordinary effort and luck had this alternative version of events survived to challenge the official narrative. And this raised the question of how many other alternative narratives had been lost, how many Merit Ptahs throughout history had tried to preserve truth but failed, and how much of what we think we know about the past is actually carefully constructed fiction created by those with the power to control the record. The account's emphasis on the importance of networks of trust and mutual support among women, the way Merit Ptah relied on other midwives and how women of different classes helped each other even when official society tried to keep them separated, resonated particularly strongly with feminist scholars who saw in these historical examples confirmation of their theories about women's resistance and resilience in patriarchal societies. And they argued that attention to these networks and to the spaces of female autonomy that existed even in highly patriarchal societies could transform our understanding of history, shifting focus from the public world of male political and military achievement to the private world of domestic life and interpersonal relationships where women exercised more influence and where much of the actual work of maintaining civilization took place. The technological advances that had made the discovery and translation of Merit Ptah's account possible were themselves worth noting, for without modern archaeological techniques and conservation methods, the fragile papyrus might have crumbled to dust when exposed to air, and without advances in linguistic understanding and computer-aided translation, the hieratic script might have remained indecipherable or ambiguous, and scholars reflected on how much knowledge might have been lost in earlier eras when such technologies did not exist, how many similar documents might have been discovered and destroyed because they could not be properly preserved or understood, and this led to renewed emphasis on the development and application of new technologies for archaeological discovery and preservation, with the hope that future generations would have even better tools for recovering and understanding the past. The account also provided evidence for patterns of historical change that historians had theorized about but had difficulty documenting, particularly the tension between reformist movements and conservative reactions, and the way that periods of rapid change often led to backlash and attempts to return to traditional ways. And Merit Ptah's description of the chaos caused by Akhenaten's religious reforms and the subsequent restoration of the old gods under Tutankhamun fit perfectly with models of revolutionary change and Thermidorian reaction that scholars had developed based on more recent historical examples. And this suggested that certain dynamics of political and social change might be relatively constant across different times and cultures, that there might be patterns to human behavior that could help us understand not just the past, but the present, and even anticipate aspects of the future. The personal relationships that Merit Ptah described, particularly her friendship with Queen Tiye and her complicated feelings toward Amenhotep, son of Hapu, and her protective love for Ptahshepses, reminded readers that history is ultimately about relationships between people, about love and loyalty, and betrayal, and the bonds that form between individuals even across vast differences in power and status, and that understanding these relationships is essential to understanding why people made the choices they did, for decisions that might seem inexplicable when viewed purely in terms of political calculation or strategic advantage, often make perfect sense when you understand the personal connections and emotional investments that shape them. And this insight encouraged historians to pay more attention to affective dimensions of political history, to the role of emotions and personal relationships in shaping events. The description of Merit Ptah's old age and her reflections on her life and choices resonated particularly strongly with older readers who recognized the mixture of regret and acceptance, the desire to justify past choices while also acknowledging their costs, the attempt to find meaning and coherence in a life that had often felt fragmented and reactive rather than unified and purposeful. And these universal aspects of the aging process helped to create identification with Merit Ptah across the vast temporal divide, making her feel less like a distant historical figure and more like someone's grandmother, someone you might have known, someone whose story mattered not just because of its historical significance, but because of its human authenticity and emotional truth. The account's ending, with Merit Ptah attending one final birth and finding peace and meaning in that simple act of service, provided a kind of redemptive closure that many readers found deeply satisfying, suggesting that despite all the moral compromises and political complications, her core identity as a midwife who helped bring life into the world remained intact, that this was who she truly was beneath all the layers of deception and manipulation she had been forced to engage in, and that returning to this essential self at the end of her life represented a kind of moral and spiritual healing, a recovery of integrity that had been fragmented by her involvement in palace intrigues. And whether this interpretation was accurate or was simply a comforting narrative that readers imposed on the text was itself a matter of debate, but the emotional power of that ending was undeniable. The fate of the document itself, after Ptahshepses created it, became the subject of speculation and investigation, with researchers trying to understand the specific circumstances of its burial and preservation, and they discovered that the house where it had been buried had remained in the family for several generations, passing from Merit Ptah to Nefru's daughter, and that each generation had apparently been told about the jar beneath the floor and had been instructed to leave it undisturbed, and this suggested a kind of sacred trust that had been maintained across at least 3 or 4 generations before the family line ended or moved away, and the knowledge of the jar's existence was lost. And the fact that this trust had been kept for so long, despite the temptation to open the jar, or the practical pressures to make use of the space, or the simple erosion of memory across generations, was itself remarkable and testified to the power of the story and the importance the family attached to preserving Merit Ptah's legacy. Modern midwives who learned about Merit Ptah's story often felt a strong sense of connection to her, recognizing in her experiences echoes of their own professional challenges and ethical dilemmas, and some midwifery organizations adopted her as a kind of patron figure, celebrating her skill and dedication, and citing her as an example of the long history of their profession, and they organized conferences and publications examining the evolution of midwifery from ancient times to the present, and considering what had been lost and what had been gained as midwifery had become more medicalized and professionalized. And these discussions often referenced Merit Ptah's combination of technical skill, intuitive understanding, and attention to the emotional and social dimensions of birth as an ideal that modern practitioners should strive to recover even as they incorporated contemporary medical knowledge and technology. The account also prompted discussions about the ethics of historical research and publication, about whether it was right to expose Merit Ptah's secrets and the secrets of the people she had sworn to protect now that they had all been dead for thousands of years, whether the oath she had taken to maintain confidentiality had an expiration date, or whether it was eternal, and scholars should have respected it by keeping the document private or even destroying it. And while most historians argued that the value of historical knowledge outweighed any residual obligation to maintain ancient confidences, especially given that all the individuals involved were long dead and beyond harm, some ethicists suggested that there were principles at stake that transcended temporal boundaries, that promises should be kept and confidences should be maintained, regardless of how much time had passed, and that the casual violation of Merit Ptah's oath, even in the service of historical knowledge, set a troubling precedent and suggested that modern scholars believed themselves exempt from the moral obligations that bound historical actors. The question of how to tell Merit Ptah's story to different audiences became a practical concern for educators and museum curators, for the account contained elements that were politically sensitive and morally complex, and that might be difficult for younger audiences to process, and there were debates about whether children should be taught a simplified version that emphasized Merit Ptah's skill as a midwife and her care for babies, while downplaying the deception and manipulation, or whether that would be a disservice that perpetuated exactly the kind of sanitized history that Merit Ptah's account challenged. And most educators eventually concluded that age-appropriate versions could be created for different audiences, but that older students and adults should be exposed to the full complexity of the story and encouraged to grapple with its moral ambiguities, rather than being offered easy answers or comfortable interpretations. Nubia was Egypt's ancient enemy and sometime vassal, source of gold and ivory and slaves, and the current pharaoh Amenhotep III had campaigned there in his youth, putting down rebellions and extracting tribute. But he had also taken Nubian princesses as minor wives to cement alliances, and the court was full of Nubian servants, soldiers, and even some minor officials. Yet for the wife of the chief architect, a woman of the Egyptian nobility, to bear a child who was so obviously of mixed blood suggested an affair that could destroy her utterly if it became known, could lead to her execution and the erasure of her name from every monument. The second death that Egyptians feared more than the first, the death of memory that meant true annihilation with no hope of resurrection in the field of reeds. Merit Ptah wrapped the baby in linen and placed him on Mutemwia's chest, and the new mother's face showed a complicated mixture of love and despair as she looked down at her son, and she whispered to Merit Ptah, "His name is Ptahshepses, and he will grow to be a great man if he survives this night. If he survives the plotting of those who would use him or destroy him." And Merit Ptah asked quietly, "Who is his father?" And Mutemwia laughed, a sound edged with hysteria, and replied, "That is the question that will either save Egypt or damn it, and I am not sure I know the answer myself, for the truth is complicated and dangerous, and involves people whose names I dare not speak, even in this room where only women attend, and the gods themselves might be listening." Before Merit Ptah could press for more information, the door to the birthing chamber opened, and a man entered, which was itself a violation of ancient custom, for men were forbidden from the mysteries of birth, their presence considered polluting to the sacred feminine power that brought forth life. But this man entered with such authority that the servant women fell back against the walls, and even Mutemwia, exhausted as she was, struggled to sit upright and show respect, and Merit Ptah recognized him from his distinctive profile, the jutting jaw and prominent nose that appeared on so many temple reliefs. It was Amenhotep, son of Hapu, the king's chief advisor, a man so powerful that some whispered he was the true ruler of Egypt. While Pharaoh concerned himself with building monuments and collecting wives, a man who had risen from humble origins as a scribe to become the second most powerful person in the kingdom, through a combination of brilliant administrative skill and an uncanny ability to know everyone's secrets and use them to his advantage. Amenhotep, son of Hapu, looked at the baby with an expression Merit Ptah could not read, and then he looked at Merit Ptah herself, with eyes that seemed to penetrate to her very ka, the soul that would be weighed against the feather of truth in the afterlife. And he said, Merit Ptah, daughter of Iset, granddaughter of Nefertari, you have a reputation for discretion that is as valuable as your skill with difficult births, and you are about to learn why you were specifically requested for this task, why no other midwife in Thebes would do, why, in fact, midwives were sent to attend false labors in 3 other noble houses tonight to confuse anyone who might be watching and wondering about this particular birth. He gestured to one of the servant women, who brought forward a cushioned basket of the type used to carry precious objects, and inside, Merit Ptah saw another baby, also newly born, its umbilical cord recently cut, but this child was obviously dead, its skin already taking on the waxy pallor of death. And Amenhotep, son of Hapu, said, This unfortunate infant was born 2 hours ago to a servant woman in the palace. Born dead despite the best efforts of the royal physicians. A tragedy, but not an uncommon one. And the mother has been given a potion to make her sleep and will wake remembering nothing. For I had the court magician place a spell of forgetting upon her, and when she wakes, she will believe her baby still rests in the nursery, and will be content with this belief for the few months she has remaining in this life, for she is suffering from a disease of the lungs that will take her gently to the field of reeds before the inundation comes again. Merit Ptah felt ice form in her belly as she began to understand the plot unfolding before her, and Amenhotep, son of Hapu, continued, The lady Mutemwiya has been brought to this house specifically for this birth, away from her husband's main residence, away from the curious eyes of other wives and servants, and the official story will be that she gave birth to a son who tragically died within hours of his birth, victim of the same demons that steal so many infants in their first days of life. And this dead baby will be mourned and mummified, and placed in a small tomb with all appropriate ceremonies. And Mutemwiya will recover from her grief in time, and perhaps bear other children to her husband, children whose parentage will not be questioned because they will look appropriately Egyptian. And the living child? Merit Ptah asked, though she already suspected the answer, and Amenhotep, son of Hapu, smiled, a cold expression that never reached his eyes, and said, The living child will be taken to a family I have selected, a minor official and his wife, who have been trying unsuccessfully to conceive for 7 years, and they will raise him as their own son, never knowing his true origins, and he will grow up far from the intrigues of court, perhaps becoming a scribe, or a priest, or a soldier, living an ordinary life, and this will be the best outcome for everyone involved. For the alternative is that questions would be asked about his parentage, questions that would lead to answers that would destabilize the very foundations of the kingdom. Merit Ptah looked at Mutemwiya, expecting to see protest or grief, but the lady simply held her baby tighter and closed her eyes. And Merit Ptah realized that this plan had already been agreed to, that Mutemwiya had known from the moment she felt the baby quicken in her womb that she would have to give him up, and the despair on her face was not the despair of learning terrible news, but the despair of facing a long-anticipated tragedy. And Merit Ptah felt a surge of sympathy for this woman who had loved unwisely or been used by forces beyond her control, and now had to pay the price that women always paid when they became entangled in the games of powerful men. Why tell me all this? Merit Ptah asked Amenhotep, son of Hapu. Why not simply switch the babies and let me believe the official story? And he replied, Because you are an intelligent woman who would have noticed the discrepancies, the timing of the pregnancy, the appearance of the child, and you would have wondered and perhaps asked questions or shared your observations with others, and I cannot allow any thread of this story to unravel. So instead, I am trusting you with the truth, or at least part of it. Enough truth to bind you to secrecy. For now you are complicit in the deception. Now you have helped switch a living baby for a dead one. And if this plot is ever discovered, you will be executed alongside everyone else involved. Your name will be erased from your tomb. Your daughter will be sold into slavery, and your Ka will wander the desert for eternity, never finding peace in the afterlife. The threat was delivered in such a calm, conversational tone that it took Merit Ptah a moment to fully grasp its enormity. And when she did, she felt her knees weaken, and she sat down heavily on one of the birthing bricks, and she asked, "What is the truth you are not telling me? Who is the father of this child, and why does his existence threaten the kingdom?" Amenhotep, son of Hapu, was silent for a long moment, studying her face, and then he said, "The father is Myherpri, champion of the king, keeper of the royal stables, and leader of Pharaoh's Nubian guard, a man who has served Egypt faithfully for 20 years, a man who was once a prince in Kush before his kingdom was conquered, and he was brought to Egypt as a hostage to ensure his people's good behavior, a man who has become so trusted that Pharaoh considers him almost a brother, and therein lies the problem. For if it became known that Myherpri had bedded the wife of the chief architect, it would not just be an ordinary case of adultery. It would be seen as a symbol of Nubian presumption, of foreigners overstepping their place, and there are factions at court who would use it as an excuse to purge all Nubians from positions of power, to break the alliances that keep the southern border peaceful, and to launch new wars of conquest that would drain Egypt's treasury and fill our streets with mourning women. Merit Ptah absorbed this information, and pieces of a larger puzzle began to fit together in her mind, for she remembered hearing about Myherpri, remembered the stories of his valor in battle and his skill with horses, remembered seeing him once at a festival, a tall man with skin like polished ebony and the bearing of a king, and she could imagine how a lonely noblewoman might fall in love with such a man, or how such a man might fall in love with her, and she asked, "Does Myherpri know about the child?" And Amenhotep, son of Hapu, shook his head and said, "He knows only that Mutemwea was pregnant, and that the child would be raised as the son of her husband. He does not know about tonight's switch. He does not know that his son will grow up ignorant of his true father, and it is better that way. For Myherpri is an honorable man who might do something foolish if he knew the full truth, might try to claim the child or make the affair public, and that would force me to have him killed, which would be a waste of a valuable servant and would anger Pharaoh, who is fond of him." The account's influence extended beyond academic and educational contexts into popular culture, where Merit Ptah became a character in video games and graphic novels, and even a children's animated series that presented a very loosely adapted version of her story. And while these popular adaptations often bore little resemblance to the historical reality, they testified to the power of her story to capture imaginations, and to the way that historical figures could become mythical archetypes that served contemporary cultural needs. And scholars studying popular culture noted that the Merit Ptah of these adaptations was often portrayed as more heroic and more unambiguously virtuous than the historical Merit Ptah had been, suggesting that audiences still wanted clear moral heroes, even when engaging with stories that originated from morally ambiguous historical realities. The linguistic analysis of the account itself revealed interesting features of late 18th dynasty hieratic script and provided examples of vocabulary and grammatical constructions that were not well attested in other sources, and linguists used these examples to refine their understanding of the evolution of the Egyptian language and to correct some previous translations of other texts that had been based on incomplete knowledge of how certain words and phrases were actually used in practice. And this demonstrated how even a single new text could have ripple effects throughout an entire field of study, forcing scholars to reconsider assumptions and revise previous work in light of new evidence. The account provided a case study in the relationship between individual agency and structural constraints, showing how Merit Ptah had exercised choices within a system that severely limited her options, and sociologists and political scientists studying the nature of power and resistance drew on her story to illustrate theoretical concepts about how people navigate oppressive systems, about the difference between accommodation and collaboration, about the spaces of autonomy that exist even in highly controlled environments, and about the moral complexity of survival in unjust societies. And these theoretical discussions fed back into historical analysis, providing frameworks for understanding not just Merit Ptah's experience, but the experiences of countless other people throughout history who had faced similar dilemmas. The archaeological context of the discovery also became significant, for the fact that the jar had been buried in a private home rather than in a tomb or temple suggested that there was a whole category of historical documents that might exist in domestic contexts, but that archaeologists had not been systematically looking for because they had focused their attention on more obviously significant sites like royal tombs and major temples, and this led to new initiatives to excavate residential areas more thoroughly and to pay more attention to finds that might seem mundane, but that could contain valuable historical information. And some significant discoveries were made in the wake of this shift in archaeological priorities, vindicating the intuition that important history had been hidden in unexpected places. The question of authenticity, which had initially been a major concern among scholars, was eventually settled through a combination of linguistic analysis, material testing of the papyrus and ink, contextual consistency with other known facts about the period, and the discovery of corroborating evidence from other sources. And while a few skeptics continued to argue that the document might be a sophisticated ancient forgery or a later composition attributed to Ptahshepses, the scholarly consensus firmly supported its authenticity, and it was accepted as a genuine first-hand account from the late 18th dynasty. And this authentication process itself became a model for how to evaluate newly discovered ancient texts, with clear protocols and multiple lines of evidence being required before claims of authenticity were accepted. The emotional impact of reading Merit Ptah's own words, or at least Ptahshepses's careful transcription of her oral testimony, was something that many readers commented on, for there was an immediacy and intimacy to the account that was different from the formal inscriptions and official documents that made up most of the evidence for ancient Egyptian history, and readers felt that they were hearing a real person's voice, speaking across the millennia, sharing not just facts but feelings, not just events but their human meaning. And this emotional connection made ancient Egypt feel less distant and more accessible, transformed it from an object of academic study into a source of human wisdom and insight. And many readers reported that encountering Merit Ptah's story changed their relationship to history generally, made them more interested in the lives of ordinary people and less focused on kings and battles, more attuned to moral complexity and less satisfied with simple narratives of progress or decline. The account also provided evidence for the existence of a literate culture that extended beyond the scribal elite. For while Ptahshepses was himself a scribe, Merit Ptah was not. Yet she clearly understood the importance of written records and was involved in planning and shaping the document, even though she did not write it herself. And this suggested that literacy and engagement with written culture might have been more widespread in ancient Egypt than previously thought, that people outside the formal scribal profession might have commissioned writings and preserved documents and transmitted knowledge through written as well as oral means. And this led to reconsideration of assumptions about literacy rates and the social distribution of knowledge in ancient societies. The story of how the document came to be published was itself interesting, involving academic politics and debates about who had the right to translate and interpret it. And there were disputes between the archaeologists who discovered it and the linguists who translated it and the historians who interpreted it, each group claiming primary authority over the text. And these disputes reflected larger tensions within academia about disciplinary boundaries and intellectual property, and the collaborative versus competitive nature of scholarship. And eventually, a compromise was reached, where the initial publication included contributions from specialists in different fields. But the translation and interpretation remained contested terrain, with different scholars continuing to produce alternative versions and readings. The account's revelation of the baby switch involving Ptahshepses led to genetic investigations, with researchers attempting to trace his descendants through DNA analysis to see if they could confirm the account's claims about his Nubian heritage. And while this proved difficult, given the passage of time and the challenges of extracting reliable DNA from ancient remains, some preliminary results suggested that there were indeed genetic markers consistent with sub-Saharan African ancestry in the family line that was believed to descend from Ptahshepses, and while this was far from definitive proof, it provided independent support for the account's accuracy and demonstrated how modern scientific techniques could be used to test historical claims and to recover information that would otherwise be inaccessible. The political implications of the account were not lost on modern Egyptians, particularly those interested in questions of national identity and the relationship between ancient and modern Egypt. And there were debates about what Merit Ptah's story revealed about ancient Egyptian attitudes toward race and ethnicity, and whether ancient Egypt should be understood as an African civilization or as something distinct from both Africa and the Mediterranean world. And these debates were often heated and politically charged, reflecting contemporary tensions about identity and belonging, and Merit Ptah's account became ammunition in these debates, with different sides emphasizing different aspects of the story to support their predetermined conclusions about Egyptian identity. The account inspired new research into other midwives who might have left traces in the historical record, and scholars began to search more systematically for mentions of midwives in ancient texts and to examine material evidence for birth practices and maternal health care, and this led to the identification of several other named midwives from ancient Egypt and to a better understanding of how their profession was organized and regulated and what status they held in society. And gradually, a picture emerged of a sophisticated system of maternal health care that had been largely invisible in previous historical accounts because it was women's work and therefore not deemed worthy of extensive documentation by male scribes and officials. The preservation of Merit Ptah's account also raised questions about what other stories might be waiting to be discovered. What other voices from the past might have tried to leave records that could challenge or complicate official histories. And this led to renewed energy in archaeological and historical research, with scholars and excavators motivated by the hope of finding more personal accounts like Merit Ptah's that could provide intimate insights into ancient lives and experiences. And while most excavations did not yield anything as dramatic as her testimony, the search itself was valuable in pushing researchers to look in new places and to pay attention to materials they might previously have overlooked. And occasionally, smaller discoveries were made that added pieces to the puzzle of how ordinary people experienced and understood their worlds. The educational impact of Merit Ptah's story was significant, with her account being incorporated into curricula at various levels, used to teach not just ancient history but also ethics and critical thinking and the complexity of moral decision-making. And students who encountered her story often reported that it challenged their assumptions about history and morality and made them think more deeply about how they would respond to difficult situations. And teachers valued the account because it resisted easy moralizing and forced students to grapple with genuine ambiguity and to consider multiple perspectives. And this pedagogical value ensured that Merit Ptah's story would continue to be read and discussed by new generations of students who might then develop their own interpretations and insights. The commemoration of Merit Ptah took various forms, from academic conferences held in her honor, to the naming of a midwifery school after her, to the creation of awards recognizing excellence in midwifery and women's health care. And these commemorations served to keep her memory alive and to acknowledge the importance of her profession and the value of the knowledge she had preserved. And they also created occasions for reflection on how far midwifery and maternal health care had come since her time, and how much further they still needed to go. particularly in parts of the world where women still lacked access to skilled birth attendants and where maternal mortality rates remained tragically high. The story's treatment of political power and its corrupting influence resonated with modern readers who lived in societies where similar dynamics of manipulation and deception operated, where powerful people used their positions to distort truth and to treat others as means to their ends. And Merit Pita's account served as a reminder that these patterns were not new, that the abuse of power was a constant temptation throughout human history, and that the struggle to maintain integrity and humanity in the face of such power was an ongoing challenge that each generation had to face anew. And this recognition of continuity across time gave readers a sense of connection to the past, and also a sense of responsibility to learn from historical examples and to resist the same patterns of corruption and manipulation in their own contexts. The account's depiction of cross-cultural and cross-class relationships, particularly the love between Maherpri and Mutemwia that had been forbidden and punished, spoke to contemporary concerns about prejudice and discrimination and the human cost of social boundaries. And readers who had experienced discrimination based on race or class or other characteristics identified with the lovers whose relationship had been deemed unacceptable by the society around them, and the tragedy of their separation and Maherpri's death resonated as a warning about what happens when societies prioritize maintaining boundaries over recognizing common humanity. And this made Merit Pita's ancient story feel urgently relevant to contemporary struggles for equality and justice. The question of forgiveness also ran through the account, with Merit Pita clearly struggling to forgive herself for her compromises and her participation in deceptions, and with other characters like Mutemwia seeking forgiveness for their choices. And readers reflected on the nature of forgiveness and whether it was possible to forgive yourself for moral failures, and whether the passage of time changed moral culpability. And these reflections often became personal as readers considered their own lives and their own compromises and the ways they had fallen short of their ideals. And Merit Pita's story offered not easy absolution, but rather the recognition that most people carry regrets, and the suggestion that continuing to serve others and to seek truth even imperfectly might be a path toward redemption, if not complete forgiveness. The document's survival itself became a symbol of hope for those concerned about the preservation of truth and memory, a reminder that even when powerful forces try to erase inconvenient truths, sometimes records survive, sometimes voices from the past break through the silence, and sometimes we are able to recover stories that were meant to be forgotten. And this gave hope that other suppressed truths might eventually come to light, and that the work of historical research and preservation was meaningful and important, that it mattered to keep searching and questioning and refusing to accept official narratives at face value. In the end, Merit Pita's legacy was complex and multifaceted, encompassing her contributions to the medical care of countless women and babies, her role in the political intrigues of one of ancient Egypt's most fascinating periods, her preservation of truth in the face of powerful forces that wanted it hidden, and her embodiment of the moral complexities that confront anyone who tries to maintain integrity while surviving in corrupt systems. And different people emphasized different aspects of this legacy depending on their own interests and values, but all agreed that her story was remarkable and that its survival and discovery had enriched historical understanding and provided valuable insights into both ancient Egypt specifically and human nature generally. The final lines of Ptahshepsut's account, which Merit Ptah had apparently dictated to him shortly before her death, captured something essential about her perspective and her hard-won wisdom, and these lines were often quoted and discussed and debated, for they seemed to distill the lessons she had learned from a long and complicated life. And they read, "I have brought many children into this world, and I have kept many secrets, and I have made many compromises that I am not proud of. And when my heart is weighed in the afterlife, I do not know whether it will be found light or heavy. But I hope that the gods will see that I tried to protect the innocent and to serve life, even when I could not always serve truth. And I hope that the children I delivered will live good lives, and that their children's children will inherit a better world than the one I lived in. And I hope that someday people will understand that we are all caught between forces larger than ourselves, and that we do our best with the limited choices we are given, and that this is all any of us can do, and that sometimes our best is not good enough, but it is still worth doing, and that life goes on, despite our failures and our compromises, and that new babies keep being born, and they deserve our care and our protection, regardless of who their parents are or what political complications surround them. And this is what I have tried to give, this care and this protection. And if I have failed in some ways, I have also succeeded in others. And I leave it to the gods and to those who come after to judge whether my life had meaning and value. These words, simple and honest and deeply human, seem to transcend the specific historical context and to speak to universal aspects of human experience. The struggle to find meaning, the hope that our work matters, the recognition of our limitations, the desire to be understood and perhaps forgiven, and the commitment to keep serving life despite all complications. And readers across thousands of years and vast cultural differences found themselves moved by Merit Ptah's voice and grateful that Ptahshepses had preserved it, and that time and chance had allowed it to survive until it could be heard again and could remind us all of what it means to be human, to live with integrity as best we can in an imperfect world, and to hope that our small acts of care and protection might add up to something meaningful, even when the larger forces of history seem indifferent to individual struggles and sorrows. And what of Amenhotep Sisay, the supposed father? Merit Ptah asked. What does he know of this? And Amenhotep, son of Hapu's expression turned calculating, and he said, the chief architect knows that his wife was unfaithful, for he is not a fool, and he noticed when she began to swell with child, despite the fact that he had not touched her in more than a year, their marriage being one of political convenience rather than passion, but he does not know the identity of her lover, and he has agreed to accept the official story of a stillbirth in exchange for certain considerations, a promotion to overseer of all the king's works, a larger house, and the cancellation of certain debts he incurred through gambling and unwise investments. And he is satisfied with this arrangement because it allows him to save face and advance his career without the scandal of a public divorce or the inconvenience of having to raise another man's child. Merit Ptah felt dizzy with the complexity of the plot, the layers of deception and manipulation, and she wondered how Amenhotep, son of Hapu, kept track of all the threads he was pulling, all the secrets he was keeping, all the people he was controlling. And she realized that this was what power truly meant in Egypt, not the power to command armies or build temples, but the power to know everyone's secrets and use them to weave the fate of the kingdom according to your own design. And she felt both awe and revulsion at the man standing before her, a man who could arrange lives and deaths with the casual efficiency of a scribe organizing papyrus scrolls. I will keep your secret, Merit Ptah said, though in her heart she wondered if she would be allowed to live long enough for her silence to matter. For surely the safest course for Amenhotep, son of Hapu, would be to eliminate everyone who knew the truth. And as if reading her thoughts, he said, you are wondering if I will have you killed to ensure your silence. And the answer is no, for several reasons. First, you have family and friends who would notice your disappearance and ask questions, and I prefer to avoid unnecessary complications. Second, you have a reputation that makes you valuable, and there may be other situations where I need a midwife who can be trusted with delicate matters. And third, you have just sworn an oath by Ma'at, and I believe that oath will bind you more securely than any threat I could make, for you are a woman who fears the judgment of the gods more than the judgment of men, and that makes you more reliable than someone who acts from fear alone. He was right about that, Merit Ptah reflected bitterly, for she did fear the weighing of the heart that awaited every soul in the afterlife, feared that Anubis would place her heart on one side of the scale and the feather of truth on the other, and find her heart heavy with lies and deception, and she would be fed to Ammit and cease to exist But she also knew that some lies were necessary to protect the innocent, that sometimes the truth was a weapon that hurt more than it healed, and she hoped that the gods in their wisdom would understand her choices, even if she struggled to understand them herself. Amenhotep, son of Hapu, gave instructions to the servant women, who began the process of cleaning Mutemwia and preparing her for the public mourning that would begin at dawn. And he handed the living baby, Ptahshepses, to Merit Ptah, and said, "You will take this child to a house in the potter's quarter, to a man named Passer and his wife Tia, and you will tell them that the gods have answered their prayers and sent them a son, that you found him abandoned at the temple of Hathor, left there by a mother who could not keep him, and they will believe you because they want to believe, because they have prayed for a child for so many years that they will not question this miracle too closely, and you will perform the proper rituals to make it seem that Tia gave birth to the child. You will provide her with herbs to make her breasts produce milk, and you will visit them regularly for the next month to maintain the fiction that this was a normal birth." Merit Ptah looked down at the baby in her arms, at little Ptahshepses, who had no idea that his life had already been decided by forces beyond his control, who would grow up never knowing that he was the son of a champion and a noblewoman, never knowing that his very existence had threatened to topple the carefully balanced order of the kingdom, and she felt a fierce protectiveness for this innocent child who had committed no crime except being born, and she made a silent vow to watch over him from afar, to ensure that he grew up safe and healthy, even if she could never tell him the truth of his origins. The night was fading toward dawn when Merit Ptah left the house of Amenhotep Sisay, carrying the baby wrapped in common linen rather than the fine fabrics appropriate to his true station, and the guard who had brought her escorted her to the potter's quarter, a neighborhood of modest homes where the air always smelled of wet clay and kiln smoke. And Merit Ptah reflected on the irony that this child, who might have grown up in palaces, would instead grow up in a house where his adoptive father shaped mud into vessels for storing grain and oil. But perhaps that was better. Perhaps Ptahshepses would be happier in obscurity, safe from the intrigues and dangers of court life, able to marry for love rather than politics, able to speak freely without weighing every word for hidden meanings and potential consequences. Pacer and Tia received the baby with tears of joy, their gratitude so overwhelming that Merit Ptah felt ashamed of the deception she was perpetrating. But she reminded herself that she was giving these good people the child they had desperately wanted, and giving Ptahshepses a chance at a normal life, and surely that balanced the scales, at least partially. Surely the gods would see that her intentions were good, even if her methods involved lies and manipulation. And she spent 2 hours with the couple, teaching Tia how to hold the baby, how to feed him, showing Pacer how to change the linen wrappings and clean the umbilical stump, and all the while she was performing a kind of magic, weaving a story that would become reality through repetition and belief, creating a past that had never happened, but that would be accepted as truth by everyone who heard it. When Merit Ptah finally returned to her own home, the sun was rising over the eastern desert, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, and she found her daughter Nefru awake and worried, pacing the courtyard and starting every time she heard footsteps in the street. And when Nefru saw her mother, she ran forward with a cry of relief and embraced her, saying, "I was so worried. You have never been gone all night before. I thought something terrible had happened." And Merit Ptah held her daughter close and breathed in the scent of her hair, lotus oil and youth and innocence. And she thought about all the ways she was protecting Nefru by not telling her the truth. For knowledge was a burden and ignorance was sometimes a blessing. And she said simply, "It was a difficult birth, but the mother and baby are both fine," which was true in a way, though not in the way that Nefru would understand it. Merit Ptah tried to sleep, but her mind would not quiet, replaying the events of the night, analyzing every word that Amenhotep, son of Hapu, had spoken, wondering what he had not told her. For she was certain that there were deeper layers to this plot that she had not been shown, and she thought about Mutemwia lying in that birthing chamber, mourning a son who was not dead, but who was lost to her just the same. And she thought about my Herpri going about his duties in the royal stables, unaware that his son had been born and stolen away. And she thought about the chief architect, who had sold his honor for a promotion and the erasure of debts. And she thought about how everyone involved in this night's work had made compromises with truth and morality. And she wondered if this was always how the world worked, if the grand stories of gods and heroes were just pretty lies that concealed sordid realities of ambition and betrayal, and the weak being crushed by the powerful. 3 days later, Merit Ptah was summoned again, this time to the palace itself, and her heart hammered with fear as she followed the servant through corridors decorated with images of Pharaoh smiting his enemies and receiving tribute from conquered lands. And she was brought not to a birthing chamber, but to a garden where Amenhotep, son of Hapu, waited beside a pool filled with lotus flowers. And he dismissed the servant with a gesture and said to Merit Ptah, "You have done well. The family has accepted the child without question, and the official mourning for the Lady Mutempwia's stillborn son has been completed with appropriate ceremony. And now I have another task for you, one that will require you to use not your skills as a midwife, but your skills as an observer and a keeper of secrets." Merit Ptah felt a chill despite the warm morning sun, for she had hoped that her involvement in this affair was finished, that she could return to her normal life of attending births and grinding herbs and teaching her daughter the mysteries of midwifery. But she should have known that once you became entangled in the webs that Amenhotep, son of Hapu, spun, escape was not so simple. And she asked, "What do you want from me?" And he replied, "I want you to attend the queen, the great royal wife Tia, for she is pregnant with what may be Pharaoh's last child, and I need someone I can trust to be present at the birth. Someone who will report to me everything that happens, every word spoken, every visitor who comes to pay respects, for there are factions at court who have their own plans for the succession, and this child may become a piece in a very dangerous game." The mention of Queen Tia made Merit Ptah's breath catch, for Tia was legendary, a woman of common birth who had married Pharaoh and become the most powerful queen Egypt had seen in generations. A woman who appeared on temple reliefs, standing equal to Pharaoh rather than kneeling at his feet. A woman who corresponded with foreign kings and advised on matters of state and was rumored to be the true power behind the throne. And the thought of attending such a woman, of being in the presence of such concentrated power and ambition, was both terrifying and exhilarating. And Merit Ptah found herself saying yes before she had fully thought through the implications, drawn by the same fascination that makes a mouse creep closer to a snake even knowing the danger. The queen's pregnancy is not yet common knowledge, Amenhotep, son of Hapu, continued. She is only 3 months along, and she wishes to keep it quiet until she is certain the baby will survive. For she has had 2 miscarriages in the past 3 years, and she is no longer young, and carrying a child at her age involves risks. But I am telling you now, so that you can begin to establish a relationship with her, so that when the time comes for the birth she will trust you and speak freely in your presence, not guarding her words as she does with the royal physicians, who are all men and all connected to various political factions. Merit Ptah asked, "Why does the queen need someone to spy for you? Surely she is your ally in whatever games you are playing?" And Amenhotep, son of Hapu's expression became guarded, and he said, "The queen is nobody's ally except her own and Pharaoh's. She pursues the interests of Egypt as she understands them, and sometimes those interests align with mine, and sometimes they do not. And there are matters concerning this pregnancy that she has not shared even with me, and I need to know what she is planning. For a queen with secrets is a dangerous thing, especially when those secrets involve the succession and the future of the kingdom." He handed Merit Ptah a small alabaster jar, sealed with wax and bearing the royal cartouche, and he said, "This contains a salve made by the royal physicians, a mixture that is supposed to prevent miscarriage, and you will present it to the queen as a gift, telling her that you prepared it yourself, using a secret recipe handed down from your grandmother, and this will be your introduction to her, your excuse to begin attending her, and once you have gained her confidence, you will report to me weekly, telling me everything you observe, and in exchange I will pay you more than you could earn in a year of attending normal births, and I will ensure that your daughter is married to a scribe from a good family, a marriage that will elevate your family status and ensure your comfort in your old age." The bribe was as blatant as the threat had been subtle, and Merit Ptah recognized the pattern of control, the stick and the carrot, fear and reward, the tools that powerful men use to bend others to their will, and she wanted to refuse, wanted to tell Amenhotep, son of Hapu, that she was a midwife, not a spy, that she served women and babies, not political schemers. But she thought of Nefru and the uncertain future that awaited a midwife's daughter in a city where opportunities for women were limited. And she thought of the secrets she already carried, the knowledge that bound her to Amenhotep, son of Hapu, whether she wished it or not. And she took the alabaster jar and nodded her acceptance, feeling as though she was sealing her fate with that simple gesture, stepping further into a labyrinth from which she might never find her way out. The audience with Queen Ta was arranged for the following week, and Merit Ptah spent the intervening days in a state of nervous preparation, consulting with other midwives about the proper protocols for addressing royalty, practicing her bows and her formal greetings, and trying to calm the anxiety that made her hands shake and her stomach rebel against food. And Nefru noticed her mother's distress and asked what was wrong, and Merit Ptah could not tell her the truth, so she invented a story about attending a difficult birth that had left her shaken, another lie to add to the growing collection, and she wondered when she had become someone who lied so easily, when deception had become her natural mode of speech rather than honesty. Queen Ta received her in a private chamber, decorated with images of Hathor, the goddess of love and motherhood, and Merit Ptah's first impression was of intelligence, of a mind that missed nothing and forgot nothing, eyes that assessed and categorized and judged with the speed and precision of a trained scribe tallying grain. And the queen was smaller than Merit Ptah had expected, her body compact and muscular rather than soft and pampered, and her face, though lined with age and the weight of power, still showed traces of the beauty that had first caught Pharaoh's eye decades ago, when she had been nothing but the daughter of a minor official, and he had been a young prince with the world at his feet. "You are Merit Ptah," the queen said, and it was not a question but a statement. And Merit Ptah bowed low and offered the alabaster jar, Recitin, G, the speech she had prepared about her grandmother's secret recipe. And Queen Ta took the jar and examined it with the same careful attention she might give to a diplomatic letter. And then she said, "Amenhotep, son of Hapu, sent you. Did he not? He thinks I do not know his methods, thinks I cannot recognize his hand in every gift and gesture, but I have been playing this game since before he was born, and I can smell his schemes the way a dog smells fear." And Merit Ptah felt her carefully prepared lies crumble, felt exposed and vulnerable, and she did not know how to respond. And Queen Ta laughed, a sound that was surprisingly warm and human, and said, "Do not look so frightened. I am not angry with you. You are simply doing what you must to survive in a world that gives women few choices and little power, and I respect that, for I have done far worse in my time, and I did not rise from nothing to become great royal wife by being squeamish about the methods required to achieve my goals." The queen gestured for Merit Ptah to sit, which was itself a tremendous honor, for normally one did not sit in the presence of royalty without explicit permission, and Merit Ptah perched nervously on a cushioned stool, while Queen Ta poured wine from a golden pitcher, another breach of protocol, for queens did not serve others, and Merit Ptah realized that she was being tested, that the queen was deliberately violating the expected formalities to see how she would react. And Merit Ptah accepted the wine cup with steady hands and sipped the sweet date wine and waited for the queen to speak, knowing that patience was often the wisest course when dealing with the powerful. "I am going to tell you something that Amenhotep, son of Hapu, does not know," Queen Ta said, "and you are going to report it to him as he has instructed you to do, because I want him to know it. But I want him to think he has discovered it through his own cleverness, rather than receiving it as a gift from me, for that will make him more likely to believe it and less likely to wonder what I am hiding. And this is how the game is played. Merit Ptah, with layers of deception and counter-deception, with truth used as a weapon and lies used as shields. And if you are going to survive in this world, you need to understand that nothing is ever as simple as it appears. Merit Ptah leaned forward, drawn in despite herself, and Queen Ta continued. The child I am carrying is not Pharaoh's, though the official story will say it is. For Pharaoh has not been able to perform his husbandly duties for more than 2 years now, a fact that is known to his physicians and to me and to a very small number of trusted servants. But it is a secret that must be kept at all costs, for a pharaoh who cannot father children is seen as weakened in his divine power, and there are always those who would take advantage of such weakness to challenge his rule or to advance their own ambitions. And Merit Ptah felt the weight of this revelation like a physical blow, for she was being trusted with a secret that could bring down a dynasty, and she wondered why Queen Ta was telling her this, what game the queen was playing that required Merit Ptah to know such dangerous information. The father of my child it's a man who looks remarkably like Pharaoh did in his youth, the queen said. A distant cousin who serves in the palace guard. A man who was chosen specifically for his resemblance to the royal bloodline and for his discretion and for his understanding that his role in this matter must never be spoken of. And he has been well compensated for his service to the crown and will be sent on a diplomatic mission to Punt immediately after the birth, a mission from which he may or may not return, depending on whether I decide his continued existence poses a risk to the secret. And the casual way the queen discussed potentially ordering a man's death made Merit Ptah's blood run cold, and she understood that this was what power really meant, the ability to treat human lives as game pieces to be sacrificed for strategic advantage. You are wondering why I am telling you this, Queen Ta said, reading Merit Ptah's expression with unsettling accuracy. And the answer is that I need Amenhotep, son of Hapu, to believe that he knows my secret, that he has leverage over me. For if he believes he can control me through his knowledge of the baby's true parentage, he will feel secure and confident. And secure, confident enemies make mistakes. They become careless. And I am waiting for Amenhotep, son of Hapu, to make a mistake that will allow me to remove him from power. For while he has been useful in many ways, he has also become too powerful, too ambitious, and I fear that his ultimate goal is to place his own candidate on the throne when Pharaoh dies. And I cannot allow that, for I have my own plans for the succession. Merit Ptah's mind was reeling, trying to keep track of the layers of plotting and counterplotting, and she asked, "But if you know that I will report this to Amenhotep, son of Hapu, how can you trust that I will not also tell him that you deliberately revealed it to me?" And Queen Ta smiled, a smile that reminded Merit Ptah of a crocodile basking in the sun, and said, "Because if you tell him that, you lose your value to both of us. For I will no longer be able to use you as a conduit for the information I want him to have. And he will no longer trust you because you have demonstrated that you cannot keep secrets even when it is in your interest to do so. And you will find yourself cast aside by both sides, vulnerable to whichever of us decides that you know too much and need to be silenced. But if you play your role correctly, if you report to him as though you discovered this secret through careful observation, you remain valuable to both of us. And that gives you a kind of power, the power of the person who stands between two great forces and can influence which way the balance tips." It was a terrifying kind of power, Merit Ptah thought. The power of the mouse that runs between the feet of fighting elephants, likely to be crushed by either side regardless of which one wins. But she understood the logic of Queen Ta's argument, and she understood that she had no choice but to play the role that had been assigned to her. And she asked, "What do you want from me, truly? Beyond simply reporting to Amenhotep, son of Hapu?" And the queen's expression softened slightly, showing something that might have been genuine emotion beneath the calculating exterior. And she said, "I want you to be the midwife you were trained to be. I want you to help me carry this child safely to term and deliver him into the world. I want you to protect him with all your skill and knowledge. For this baby is the future of Egypt, whether anyone else knows it or not. and I have seen enough death and loss in my years. I have buried children and watched my husband decline from a god on earth into a frail old man who can barely walk from his bedchamber to his throne. And I need this child to live. I need him to be strong and healthy, and I am trusting you to help me achieve that." The vulnerability in Queen Tia's voice was unexpected and deeply humanizing, and Merit Ptah felt her resentment at being used as a pawn in political games soften into something like sympathy, for she recognized the fear that every pregnant woman carries, the fear that something will go wrong, that the baby will be born dead or deformed or too weak to survive, and queen or commoner, that fear was the same, and Merit Ptah had dedicated her life to helping women through that fear, to guiding them safely through the dangerous passage of childbirth. And she said, "I will do everything in my power to protect you and your child. This I swear by Hathor and Tauret, and all the gods who watch over women and babies." And she meant it with a sincerity that surprised her, given all the lies and deceptions she had been part of in recent weeks. Over the following months, Merit Ptah became a regular presence in the queen's private chambers, attending her weekly to check the progress of the pregnancy, to provide herbs and remedies for the various discomforts that afflicted even royal mothers, and to listen to the queen's concerns and fears. And gradually, a kind of friendship developed between them, as unlikely as that seemed, given the vast difference in their stations. For Queen Tia seemed to appreciate having someone she could speak to honestly, without the constant calculation that characterized all her other relationships, and Merit Ptah found herself genuinely liking this complicated woman, who wielded power with such skill and ruthlessness, but who also showed moments of surprising kindness and humor. During these visits, Merit Ptah learned much about the inner workings of the palace, about the various factions competing for influence, about the fragile health of Pharaoh Amenhotep III, who suffered from painful teeth and swollen joints, and a disease that made his skin erupt in sores, about the crown prince Amenhotep, who would one day be Pharaoh Amenhotep IV, and who was already showing signs of the religious fanaticism that would later lead him to abandon the traditional gods and worship only the Aten, the sun disk, and about the delicate diplomatic balance that kept Egypt at peace with the Hittites to the north, and the Nubians to the south, and the various Canaanite kingdoms to the east. And Merit Ptah began to understand that ruling Egypt was like juggling knives while walking a tightrope, requiring constant attention and perfect balance, and the knowledge that one mistake could lead to catastrophic consequences. She reported faithfully to Amenhotep, son of Hapu, feeding him the information that Queen Tia wanted him to have, carefully revealing the secret of the baby's parentage, in a way that made it seem like she had discovered it through observant questioning rather than direct revelation, and she watched his reaction carefully, seeing the gleam of satisfaction in his eyes as he believed he had gained leverage over the queen, and she felt a strange mixture of guilt and triumph, for she was betraying his trust even as she fulfilled her obligations to him, and she wondered if this was how all spies felt, torn between competing loyalties and never sure which side they truly served. Meanwhile, Merit Ptah continued to visit little Ptahshepses in the potter's quarter, watching him grow from a newborn into a healthy infant with a ready smile and curious eyes. And Passer and Tia were devoted parents who lavished love on the child they believed was a gift from the gods. And Merit Ptah felt the weight of the secret she carried about his true parentage, wondered if she should have fought harder against the plan to separate him from his mother. But she also saw how happy he was, how secure in the love of his adoptive parents, and she tried to convince herself that this was the better outcome, that sometimes lies could create a kind of truth, that the family you chose could be more real than the family you were born into. One afternoon, when Ptahshepses was 6 months old, Merit Ptah arrived for a visit to find the house in turmoil, for a stranger had come asking questions about the child, wanting to know where he had come from and who his real parents were. And Tia was terrified, convinced that someone was going to take her baby away. And Merit Ptah felt ice form in her belly as she realized that the secret was unraveling, that someone had discovered the deception or suspected the truth? And she calmed Tia with soothing words, while her mind raced through the possibilities, trying to figure out who might be investigating and what they knew, and how much danger everyone involved might be in. She reported the incident to Amenhotep, son of Hapu, who listened with a grave expression and then said, "The stranger was sent by my Herpri, who has begun to suspect that the child Mutemwia claimed was stillborn might actually be alive. For he has sources in the palace who told him about the timing of the birth and certain inconsistencies in the official story, and he is searching for his son, driven by a father's love and a warrior's determination. And this is dangerous for everyone involved. For if he finds the child and makes the connection public, it will trigger exactly the kind of crisis I was trying to prevent." "What will you do?" Merit Ptah asked, fearing that she already knew the answer. And Amenhotep, son of Hapu, said, "I am going to have my Herpri arrested on charges of plotting against Pharaoh, a false accusation, but one that will be believed because I have manufactured evidence to support it. And he will be tried and executed, and his name will be struck from all records, and his family in Nubia will be held hostage to ensure that there is no rebellion in response to his death, and this is regrettable because he was a good man and a loyal servant, but he has become a threat to the stability of the kingdom, and stability must be maintained at all costs." Merit Ptah felt sick with guilt and horror, for she understood that her report about the stranger's visit had sealed my Herpri's fate, that she had become complicit in the murder of an innocent man, and she tried to argue, saying, "Perhaps there is another way. Perhaps you could convince him that the child is truly dead. Or perhaps you could arrange for him to see the child from a distance and satisfy himself that the boy is happy and well cared for." But Amenhotep, son of Hapu, shook his head and said, "A man like my Herpri does not abandon his quest so easily. And even if I convinced him to stop searching now, he would always be a danger, always potentially ready to resume his investigation if he heard new information or had new doubts. And I cannot have that uncertainty hanging over the future of the kingdom. I cannot have the possibility that at any moment this secret might be revealed and cause the very crisis I have worked so hard to prevent. Then I am responsible for his death," Merit Ptah said, her voice barely above a whisper. And Amenhotep, son of Hapu, looked at her with something that might have been pity and said, "We are all responsible for many deaths. Every decision we make has consequences that ripple outward like waves from a stone thrown into water. And you can drive yourself mad trying to trace all those consequences and assign blame, or you can accept that we live in an imperfect world where sometimes good people die so that others may live, where sometimes we must choose the lesser evil and live with the weight of that choice. And this is the burden of power, the burden of knowledge, the burden of being someone who sees the larger pattern and must make decisions that affect thousands of lives based on incomplete information and uncertain predictions of the future." Merit Ptah left that meeting feeling as though she was drowning in moral complexity, struggling to find solid ground in a world where every action seemed tainted with compromise, and every choice led to suffering for someone. And she thought about my Herpri, who would die for the crime of loving his son and wanting to know him. And she thought about Mutemwia, who had lost her child and would now lose her lover as well. And she thought about little Ptahshepses who would grow up never knowing his true father, or that his father had died trying to find him. And she thought about Queen Tia's unborn child who would be raised as Pharaoh's son and would carry that lie through his entire life. And she wondered if all of Egypt's glory and civilization was built on such foundations of lies and deaths and secret sacrifices. If the temples and pyramids and the very order of Ma'at that supposedly governed the kingdom were just pretty facades concealing an ugly reality of power and manipulation, the execution of my Herpri was carried out quietly, without the public spectacle that usually accompanied the punishment of traitors. For Amenhotep, son of Hapu, did not want to draw attention to the case or invite questions about what the champion might have been plotting, and the official story was that he had died of a sudden illness, a fever that took him in 3 days despite the best efforts of the royal physicians. and Merit Ptah attended the funeral because she felt she owed him that much, and she stood among the mourners and watched his body being prepared for the journey to the afterlife. And she prayed that the gods would judge him fairly and find his heart light despite whatever minor crimes he might have committed in life. And she hoped that he would find peace in the field of reeds, and that someday, somehow, his son would learn the truth about his father's courage and love. Mutemwia was among the mourners as well, though she maintained the proper distance of someone who was merely a court acquaintance rather than a lover. But Merit Ptah saw the grief in her eyes, the barely controlled despair. And after the ceremony, she found a moment to speak with the lady privately, and Mutemwia gripped her hand with desperate strength and whispered, "He died because he loved us, died because he could not let go of the child we made together. And I will carry that guilt until the day I join him in the afterlife, and I pray that the gods will forgive me for the choices I made, for the weakness that led me to betray my husband and endanger everyone I loved." And Merit Ptah had no words of comfort to offer, for what could she say that would make any difference? What platitudes could ease the pain of such profound loss and regret? The months passed, and Queen Tia's pregnancy progressed, and Merit Ptah threw herself into her duties as royal midwife, with an intensity that was partly genuine dedication and partly an attempt to avoid thinking about Myherpre's death and her role in it. And she monitored the queen's health with meticulous care, noting every change in her body, adjusting her diet and her activities to minimize the risk of complications, and she prepared elaborate birth plans that took into account every possible emergency, every potential difficulty, determined that this baby would survive, even if she had to bargain with the gods themselves to ensure it. Queen Tia herself seemed to grow more anxious as the birth approached, and she confided in Merit Ptah that she had dreamed of disaster, of the baby being born with deformities, or of dying in her arms. And Merit Ptah recognized these fears as normal, as the kind of anxiety that afflicted many women in the final months of pregnancy. But she also knew that for a queen those fears carried additional weight, for the health and vigor of a royal child was seen as a reflection of the health and vigor of the kingdom itself, and a weak or sickly heir would be interpreted as a sign that the gods were displeased, that Ma'at was disturbed. And such interpretations could have political consequences that went far beyond the personal tragedy of a mother losing a child. As the due date approached, Merit Ptah moved into the palace, taking up residence in a small chamber near the queen's apartments, so that she would be immediately available when labor began. And she spent her days in nervous preparation, checking and rechecking her supplies, consulting with the royal physicians about contingency plans, and making offerings at the temple of Hathor, asking the goddess to grant the queen an easy birth and a healthy child. And at night she lay awake listening to the sounds of the palace, the footsteps of guards on their rounds, the distant music from pharaohs' banquets, the whispered conversations of servants in the corridors, and she felt the weight of history pressing down on her, the sense that she was participating in events that would be recorded on temple walls and remembered for generations, though her own name would likely be forgotten, for midwives were rarely mentioned in the official records even when they delivered kings. The labor began on a hot afternoon when the sun was at its zenith and the whole city seemed to be holding its breath in the oppressive heat, and Queen Tia's waters broke while she was meeting with foreign ambassadors, and she calmly finished the diplomatic discussions before retiring to her private chambers and summoning Merit Ptah. And even in the grip of early contractions, the queen maintained her composure, her political instincts so deeply ingrained that she could not allow herself to show weakness even in such a vulnerable moment. And Merit Ptah was impressed and slightly disturbed by such iron self-control, by the way Tia could separate her physical experience from her public persona as completely as if they were two different people. The birth was long and difficult, for Queen Tia was 42 years old, and her body was not as resilient as it had been when she bore her first children decades earlier. And Merit Ptah worked through the night and into the next day, using all her skill and knowledge to manage the pain and guide the baby into position, and she gave the queen medicines to strengthen the contractions and oils to ease the passage, and she whispered prayers and encouragements, and once, when Tia's strength seemed to be failing, Merit Ptah gripped her hand and said fiercely, "You are the great royal wife. You are the mother of Egypt. You are stronger than any pain, and you will bring this child into the world because you have survived worse than this, and you will survive this too." And the queen looked at her with eyes dark, with agony and determination, and nodded and pushed with renewed effort. The baby was finally born as the sun was setting on the second day, and Merit Ptah received him into her hands with a prayer of thanksgiving. And he was a boy, small but perfectly formed, and he cried with healthy lungs. And Merit Ptah felt a surge of relief and triumph as she cut the cord and cleaned the baby and wrapped him in royal linen. And she placed him in Queen Tia's arms and saw the expression of fierce love that transformed the queen's exhausted face. And in that moment, Merit Ptah understood that despite all the political calculations and strategic deceptions, despite the fact that this child was not Pharaoh's biological son, Tia loved him with the complete and unreserving love that any mother feels for her newborn, and that love was real even if the story of his conception was a lie. The baby was named Tutankhaten, though he would later change his name to Tutankhamun when the religious reforms of his predecessor were reversed. And Merit Ptah held him and looked into his small, perfect face and wondered what kind of man he would become, whether he would be strong enough to carry the burden of being Pharaoh, whether he would ever learn the truth about his parentage. And she thought about how history was full of such secrets. How many kings and queens had been born of deception? How many dynasties had been built on lies? And she wondered if the truth even mattered, as long as the kingdom prospered, and the people were fed, and the borders were secure. In the days following the birth, Merit Ptah remained at the palace to ensure that both mother and baby recovered properly, and she witnessed the carefully orchestrated announcements of the royal birth, the celebrations that spread through Thebes and then throughout Egypt, the delegations that came to present gifts and offer congratulations, and she saw how Pharaoh Amenhotep III, weak and aged as he was, held the baby with trembling hands and declared him a true son of Ra, born to rule Egypt and continue the glorious dynasty. And no one questioned the pronouncement, because no one dared, because Pharaoh's word was law, and his claim of paternity made it true regardless of biology. And Merit Ptah understood that this was another kind of truth, the truth of power, the truth that could reshape reality through sheer force of declaration and belief. Amenhotep, son of Hapu, summoned her once the immediate excitement had died down, and he met her in the same garden where they had first discussed her service to the queen, and he said, "You have done well. The queen is pleased with you, and the baby is healthy, and I am satisfied that you have reported to me faithfully and helped me understand the various forces at work in the palace. And now I have another task for you, one that will require you to make a difficult choice." And Merit Ptah felt her stomach tighten with apprehension, for she had learned that when Amenhotep, son of Hapu, spoke of difficult choices, he meant choices between bad options and worse ones, decisions that would haunt her conscience regardless of which path she chose. "The Lady Mutemwia is pregnant again," he said, and Merit Ptah felt shock ripple through her, for she had not known this, had not seen Mutemwia in months. And Amenhotep, son of Hapu, continued, "Her husband Amenhotep Sisay has resumed his conjugal visits, motivated perhaps by guilt over his earlier neglect, or perhaps by a desire to prove his virility after the supposed stillbirth, and Mutemwia conceived 3 months ago. And this time there is no question about the paternity. The timing is clear, and the child will look appropriately Egyptian. But there is a problem, for Mutemwia is planning to kill the baby after it is born, to smother it or poison it, or claim it died of natural causes. And she is doing this as a kind of penance for Myherpre's death, a twisted sacrifice to balance the scales. And I cannot allow this to happen because the death of another child, coming so soon after the supposed stillbirth, would raise questions and create suspicions that I do not want circulating through the court. Merit Ptah asked, "How do you know this? How can you be certain of her intentions?" And Amenhotep, son of Hapu, said, "I have servants in her household who report to me, and I have heard her speaking to herself in her private chambers, working through her guilt and her grief, in ways that make her plans quite clear. And while I sympathize with her anguish, I cannot allow her to act on these impulses. And this is where you come in, for you will attend the birth, and you will ensure that the baby survives, and if necessary, you will protect it from its own mother." Merit Ptah felt a cold fury building in her chest, and she said, "You ask me to spy on a woman in her most vulnerable moment, to betray the trust between midwife and mother, to stand between a woman and her own child, and you frame this as protecting the baby? But what you are really protecting is your web of secrets and manipulations, your careful political arrangements that treat people like game pieces to be moved around a board." And Amenhotep, son of Hapu, regarded her calmly and said, "Yes, that is exactly what I am asking you to do, and you will do it, because you have no choice, because you are already implicated in too many of my schemes to refuse now, because I hold your life and your daughter's life in my hands, and because despite your anger and your moral outrage, you know that I am right, that allowing Mutemwia to kill her baby would be a tragedy that serves no purpose, that would not bring Myherpri back or ease her guilt, that would only add another innocent death to the pile of corpses that this affair has generated." He was right, Merit Ptah admitted bitterly to herself. She had no choice, and the baby deserved to live regardless of its mother's tormented state of mind. But she hated Amenhotep, son of Hapu, in that moment with an intensity that surprised her. Hated him for his casual manipulation of lives, for his assumption that he had the right to arrange the world according to his vision of order and stability, for the way he had trapped her in a web of complicity that made her as guilty as he was for all the suffering that had resulted from his schemes, and she wondered if this was how evil perpetuated itself, not through monsters who knew they were doing wrong, but through reasonable people making practical decisions and accepting necessary compromises until they woke up one day and realized they had become the very thing they had once opposed. The birth of Mutemwia's second child took place 6 months later, and Merit Ptah attended as instructed, and she watched the lady carefully throughout the labor, looking for any sign that she intended to harm the baby, and Mutemwia must have known she was being watched, because she said nothing about her plans, simply endured the contractions with a stoicism that bordered on indifference, as though the whole process was happening to someone else and she was merely an observer. And when the baby was born, a healthy girl with the appropriate Egyptian features that would raise no questions about her parentage, Mutemwia looked at her daughter with an expression that Merit Ptah could not read, something between love and hatred, between longing and revulsion. Merit Ptah placed the baby in Mutemwia's arms, as was customary, but she remained close, ready to intervene if necessary, and for a long moment Mutemwia simply stared at the infant, and then tears began to roll down her cheeks, and she whispered, "I cannot do it. I thought I could. I thought I could make this sacrifice and somehow balance the cosmic scales. But looking at her, I see innocence. I see life. And I cannot extinguish that no matter how much I am suffering, no matter how much I want to punish myself for the choices I made that led to Myherpri's death." And she looked up at Merit Ptah with eyes full of anguish and said, "You knew, didn't you? You were watching me because someone told you what I was planning. Because even in this most private moment, I am being monitored and controlled, because I have no freedom left, no aspect of my life that is truly my own." Merit Ptah wanted to deny it, wanted to offer comfort or at least sympathy, but she was tired of lying, tired of the constant deception, and she simply nodded and said, "Yes, I knew, and I was prepared to stop you if necessary, but I am glad I did not have to. I am glad you found the strength to choose life over death, to choose your daughter's future over your own pain." And Mutemwia laughed bitterly and said, Strength? Is that what you call it? I call it weakness. I call it the inability to commit fully to any course of action. I call it the same indecision and moral cowardice that has characterized my entire life, but perhaps my daughter will be stronger than I am. Perhaps she will learn from my mistakes and find a way to live with integrity in a world that seems designed to corrupt anyone who seeks power or even just tries to survive. The baby was named Nefertari, and Merit Ptah visited the household regularly over the following months, ostensibly to check on the child's health, but really to ensure that Mutemwia's moment of maternal feeling had not been temporary, that she had truly abandoned her plan to harm the baby, and she watched as Mutemwia transformed from a woman consumed by guilt and grief into a mother who found purpose and even joy in caring for her daughter. And Merit Ptah thought about the resilience of the human spirit, the way people could survive terrible losses and find new reasons to continue living, and she hoped that Mutemwia would find peace even if complete happiness was no longer possible. Meanwhile, little Ptah Shepses continued to grow in the potter's quarter, and Merit Ptah watched him develop from an infant into a bright, curious toddler, and she saw traces of both his parents in his features, Mutemwia's fine bone structure, and Myherpre's strong frame, and she wondered if anyone besides herself noticed the resemblance, if anyone suspected the truth. But Pacer and Tia loved him completely and never questioned his origins, and the neighbors accepted him as the miracle baby who had come to the childless couple, and Merit Ptah tried to take comfort in the fact that at least one of the children caught up in these political machinations was growing up happy and secure, loved and wanted, even if that security was built on lies. One afternoon, when Ptah Shepses was 3 years old, Merit Ptah found him playing in the courtyard with a carved wooden horse, and he looked up at her with Myherpre's dark eyes and said, "Auntie Merit Ptah, my father says I can learn to read and write when I am older. He says that even though we are not rich, I can become a scribe if I work hard. Is that true?" And Merit Ptah felt her heart swell with emotion, thinking about how Myherpre would have been proud of this intelligent, brave boy, how he would have wanted exactly this for his son, the opportunity to rise through education and merit rather than birth. And she said, "Yes, it is true. You can become whatever you want if you study hard and make good choices, and I will help you. I will pay for your schooling if your parents cannot afford it, because you are special and you deserve every opportunity." And she meant it as a promise to Myherpre's memory, a way to honor the man who had died for love of this child. The years passed, and Merit Ptah continued her work as a midwife, attending births throughout Thebes, bringing babies into the world, and trying not to think too much about the larger forces that would shape those babies' lives, the political currents and social structures that would determine their fates as much as any individual choices they might make. And she trained her daughter Nefru in the midwife's arts, teaching her the herbs and the rituals and the practical techniques, but also teaching her about the moral complexities of the profession, about the secrets that must be kept and the difficult choices that sometimes had to be made, trying to prepare her for a world that was more complicated and morally ambiguous than the simple stories of good and evil that people told themselves. Queen Tia summoned Merit Ptah occasionally, not for medical reasons but simply to talk, and a genuine friendship had developed between them despite the vast difference in their stations, or perhaps because of it, for the queen seemed to appreciate having someone who knew her secrets but who wanted nothing from her except honest conversation, and they would sit in Tia's garden and discuss philosophy and religion and the nature of power, and Merit Ptah learned much from these conversations, learned to see the world through the eyes of someone who carried the weight of a kingdom on her shoulders, who made decisions that affected millions of lives, and who had to live with the consequences of those decisions, and she gained a new appreciation for the loneliness of power, the isolation that came from being someone who could never fully trust anyone, who had to calculate the implications of every word and gesture, who could never afford to be simply human without considering the political ramifications. During one of these conversations, Queen Tia told Merit Ptah about her fears for the future. about the religious tensions that were building in the court between the traditional priests of Amun-Ra and the reformers who wanted to elevate the worship of Aten, about her son, Crown Prince Amenhotep, who was increasingly obsessed with theological questions and who spoke of sweeping changes that would remake Egyptian religion and society. And the queen said, "I fear that he will tear the kingdom apart in pursuit of his vision of religious purity, that he will alienate the powerful priests and the conservative nobles and create chaos that will invite invasion or civil war. And I am trying to moderate his impulses, trying to teach him that change must come gradually if it is to be lasting. But he does not listen to me anymore. He believes he has direct communication with the divine, and that anyone who disagrees with him is standing against the will of the gods." Merit Ptah asked, "And what of Prince Tutankhaten, your youngest son? What role will he play in these coming changes?" And Queen Tiye's expression softened, as it always did when she spoke of the child she had borne so late in life. And she said, "Tutankhaten is still young, only 6 years old, but already he shows signs of being a different kind of person than his older brother, more flexible, more willing to listen to different perspectives, more interested in maintaining harmony than in imposing his vision on others. And I hope that if Amenhotep's reforms do create the chaos, I fear Tutankhaten will be the one to restore balance, to find a middle path that honors both tradition and innovation. But that is a heavy burden to place on a child. And I pray to all the gods, both the old ones and the new ones that my son wants to elevate, that Tutankhaten will be strong enough and wise enough to do what needs to be done." The conversation stayed with Merit Ptah, and she found herself watching the young prince when she visited the palace, observing him at play with other royal children, noting his kindness and his quick intelligence, and she thought about how this child, born of deception but raised in truth as far as he knew, might someday hold the fate of Egypt in his hands, might have to make choices that would affect the lives of everyone in the kingdom, and she wondered if he would have the strength and wisdom his mother hoped for, or if he would be crushed by the weight of expectations and political pressures. And she prayed for him as she prayed for all children, that he would be protected by the gods and guided toward right action. When Ptahshepses was 7 years old, Merit Ptah arranged for him to begin his education at a temple school, fulfilling the promise she had made to him years earlier, and she watched with pride as he learned to read and write, mastering the hieratic script used for everyday documents, and beginning to understand the more complex hieroglyphic writing used for religious texts and royal inscriptions. And his teachers reported that he was one of the brightest students they had ever taught, quick to memorize and eager to understand not just the mechanics of writing, but the meaning behind the texts. And Merit Ptah thought about how education was a kind of power, how it opened doors and created possibilities, and she was glad that she could give my Herpri's son this gift, even if she could never tell him it was a legacy from his true father. One day, as she was leaving the temple school after visiting Ptahshepses, Merit Ptah encountered a familiar figure, and she was shocked to recognize Mutempwia, who had apparently come for the same reason, to watch her son from a distance, unable to stay away, even though she knew she could never claim him as her own. And the two women looked at each other with understanding and shared grief, and Mutempwia said quietly, "I come here once a month, just to see him, to make sure he is healthy and happy, and it tears my heart every time, but I cannot stop myself. I need to know that he is thriving even though I gave him away, that my sacrifice was worth something." And Merit Ptah took her hand and squeezed it gently and said, "He is a wonderful boy, bright and kind, and he is loved, and that is because of the choice you made, the choice to give him a life free from the complications and dangers of court politics. And that was an act of love, even though it does not feel like it." They walked together through the temple gardens, these two women bound by secrets and shared losses, and Mutempwia told Merit Ptah about her life since the births, about how she had focused all her energy on raising Nefertari, about how her relationship with her husband had improved somewhat now that they had a daughter together, about how she was trying to build a normal life despite the ghosts that haunted her. And Merit Ptah listened with sympathy and without judgment. Understanding that people were complicated and that no one made perfect choices, that everyone was doing their best to navigate a world full of moral ambiguity and competing demands. I heard that Amenhotep, son of Hapu, is ill, Mutemwea said. The physicians say it is a wasting disease that will take him slowly, but inevitably, and I confess that I feel a kind of bitter satisfaction in knowing that he is suffering, that the man who orchestrated so much of our pain is finally facing his own mortality. But I also know that his death will not change anything, that the system he represented will continue, that there will always be powerful men making calculations about other people's lives and treating humans as game pieces in their political strategies. And Merit Ptah nodded, for she had heard the same rumors about Amenhotep, son of Hapu's declining health, and she too felt that complicated mixture of emotions, satisfaction at his suffering, mixed with the recognition that he had been a symptom rather than the cause of the underlying problems, that Egypt's political culture encouraged and rewarded the kind of ruthless manipulation he had practiced. The decline and eventual death of Amenhotep, son of Hapu, marked the end of an era, and Merit Ptah attended his funeral more out of obligation than grief, for while she had respected his intelligence and his administrative skill, she had never liked him or forgiven him for the ways he had used her and manipulated the lives of people she cared about, and she watched as he was laid to rest in a tomb that rivaled those of princes, surrounded by all the luxury and honor that Egypt could bestow on a favored servant, and she thought about how history would remember him as a great administrator and wise counselor, while the suffering he had caused would be forgotten or dismissed as necessary sacrifice for the greater good.